Chapter 1975. Published at 3rd of July, 2023. 8:21 and 39 seconds AM. Chapter 1975. Right now. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1975 right now. Valerie crashed into the building below as Lionel landed on the city walls. But just as soon as she did, she leapt to her feet, her battle intent blazing. With a flick of her wrist, the warped and broken shield was flung to the side, and she brandished her fists. She didn't have the metal synergy lineage factor, so she obviously didn't have her own divine armor. The armor that Ramon had forged for her was already extremely excellent, and yet it couldn't survive a single strike against Lionel's spear. It was clear that that spear was above the gold grade. Even though Valerie found herself unable to use spear force and wearing armor that was practically useless to her, she still brandished her fists. Lionel looked down for a moment. Despite the carnage around him, his mind seemed to be silent. The archers had recovered after their first fall. Although they realized they couldn't use their bow force for whatever reason, they immediately switched their tactics. At the same time, the non-archers below and near the city quickly gathered, prepared to battle just as James reached the door mechanisms and forced the gates open for the tide of 3 million soul constructs to rush in. Lionel met Valerie's gaze and hesitated. He almost put his spear away, but after seeing the look in her eye, he tightened his grip instead. "All right," he said lightly. "In that case." Lionel's stars suddenly pulsed and they grew a size. Each had been barely a meter across each, but they suddenly expanded to 2, then 3, then suddenly reached 10. The flood of universal force increased like a rising tide. The skies rumbled and the earth quaked. The skies above had been quite dark, but motes of lights began to quickly accumulate, each matching one of the colors of Lionel's heavenly body realm stars. Lionel raised a foot, and by the time it descended, his body had flickered and vanished. He was a blinding streak in the skies, activating star fusion, King's Might, and descending with a mighty momentum. One spear to connect the earth and skies. The black rod in Lionel's hand suddenly became a pillar of dark gold. At that moment, Ramon rushed out from the core of the city. The bags under his eyes had grown to the point they were blackened. Even so, his eyes shone like stars, a far cry from the timid gaze he had seemed to have the first time Lionel met him. When he saw Lionel's strike about to land, his expression changed and he rushed forward, but it was already too late. Valerie struck out with her fist. A surprising amount of fist force coated it as he roared. Some of the hints of simplicity that had coated her spear transitioning toward her fist. Lionel seemed struck by it at first. How long had it been since he used fist force? Longer than he could remember. Why was this fist so beautiful though? Despite its beauty, it didn't seem to matter. When Lionel's spear descended, Valerie's fist only paused it for a moment before her arm split apart like pressurized wood. Her eyes rolled back from the pain, her forearm combusting into a rain of blood and gore. She was sent flying back once more, sliding along the ground and leaving a bloody trail as she fell to Ramon's feet. Ramon's eyes widened as he hurried forward. "Valerie, Valerie." Ramon slid along his knees to her side, his brown eyes colored with anguish. He didn't seem to know what to do. He wanted to help her, but he also didn't dare to touch her for fear of making it all worse. His hands approached and retreated again and again, a flustered expression taking over him. He looked up to find the crumbling pieces of his formation still falling. Despair colored his gaze. No, it wasn't despair, it was guilt, a heavy guilt that sunk like cold in the winter or darkness in the deepest pits. Lionel recognized that gaze. It was the same gaze he had had when he watched his subordinates die one after another in the Valiant Heart Zone, subordinates that he would no longer see again now due to his own selfishness. Given Ramon's reaction alone, one could tell that the rumors about the two were nothing more than nonsense. Ramon finally reached forward and held Valerie up, if for nothing other than not wanting her to rest her head on the hard groan any longer. Valerie coughed, blood flying from her lips. Her eyes regained some focus and she looked up. Her eyes softened somewhat when she saw Ramon's tears, but then she began to push him away, coughing and wheezing all the while. "You big dope, I'm not going to die. It's just an arm. What are you doing? You're embarrassing me. How can my husband be such a crybaby?" Ramon clenched his teeth, but his tears didn't stop falling. It was his fault. It was all his fault. He didn't make a formation that was strong enough. If only he had been better. If only he had held up his end of the bargain. This would have never happened. Ramon looked toward Lionel, a fierce glare in his eyes. But at that moment, Valerie reached for his collar with her only good remaining hand and stopped him. Forget it. He has the spear domain ring, and there are probably others eyeing us right now. There's no use in fighting amongst ourselves. A Morales has to win this, for maybe the first time in their relationship, though Ramon didn't listen to Valerie. He grabbed her wrist and pulled, forcing her to loosen her grip as he stood with a dark expression hanging between his brows. He walked toward Lionel with heavy steps, bronze runes forming all along his body as his halo took form, and his divine armor began to appear piece by piece. Valerie watched his back with a complicated expression, weakness overtaking her. Ramon had been quite like Armand, not caring much about these air wars and never wanting to participate in the first place. It was only because of Valerie and the face of the Morales family that he had done so. But right now, he wasn't a Morales, nor was he an heir, or a genius fighting for glory. Right now, he was nothing more than an enraged husband. Chapter 1976. Published at 3rd of July, 2023. 8:21 and 38 seconds AM. Chapter 1976. Third, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1976. Third, Lionel and Ramon's gazes met. The latter filled with rage and the former as cool as an iceberg. Internally, though, Lionel sighed. He couldn't say that he hadn't expected something like this to happen, but this also made the situation 100 times more complicated to handle. He hadn't wanted to harm Valerie so much, but there were two reasons he had no choice but to. The first was time. He didn't have the time to be soft-hearted and battle it out with his fists. The second reason was because not going all out would only be an insult to her. While to outsiders it seemed that he was relying on the spear domain ring, he himself knew quite well that even if he took the ring off right this moment, it wouldn't change anything. His sovereignty had transcended the need for the spear domain ring. Now, however, he was faced with another choice once again. Would he go easy on Ramon? Suddenly, Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Ramon's fist had appeared right before his face, and he hadn't sensed it until it was too late. Bang! Lionel's head snapped to the side, and he took a heavy step back. His divine armor quaked once and dispersed the damage, but his pupils were still constricted. What was that just now? Ramon's fist appeared before Lionel again, but Lionel took a light step on the ground, retreating and expanding the distance between them, but somehow, Ramon's fist remained before him. Lionel raised his spear to block, but Ramon's fist flickered past it, landing heavily on his chest. Bang! 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 Lionel's feet slammed into the ground 3 times in succession, each one driving him back further, and cracking the earth beneath him. The amount of force that his armor was dispersing even caused the ground to seem to implode, as though a pressurized geyser was erupting from within. My senses are being distorted. No, they aren't being distorted. It's as though he's using blind spots to take advantage of me. But how could my internal sight have blind spots? More importantly, how could my vision have blind spots? Lionel's gaze flickered, his eyes landing on Ramon's armor. He realized after just a split moment of deduction that it was Ramon's armor. It was definitely his divine armor doing it. If Lionel was correct, the core piece of his armor should be a Dream Force domain type ore, but he couldn't sense the exact ore, which meant that just like he had with his self-created formation, Ramon had self-created an alloy for his divine armor. Lionel had done this before, so he knew exactly how difficult it was to fuse unruly 7th-dimensional ores into a single holistic piece. To do so with Dream Force-type ores was even more obscene. It was less accurate to say that Ramon was wearing a gold-grade armor, and far more accurate to say that he had taken a half-step into the life grade as well. There was no doubt that if it wasn't for Lionel, Ramon would be the strongest crafter of the Nova generation. There's only one way. Lionel deduced. Lionel crossed his spear over his body again, but it was fruitless. Ramon's strikes were becoming harder to handle, and more powerful. Lionel could sense that Ramon's fatigue was slowly fading as he pumped more and more dream force into his body. As his fatigue faded, his strikes became more precise and more powerful. The jarring feeling of his organs being displaced shook Lionel awake. Ramon's power was getting to the point where even his divine armor was being overloaded. If there was anyone who was surprised, though, it was Ramon. Lionel had taken several direct shots and was clearly trying his best to block and failing. He had aimed for several vital points that should have left him entirely incapacitated. How could a divine armor forged by a sixth-dimensional expert had such great defense? Suddenly, Ramon's eyes widened. First he was focused on Valerie. Then he had lost himself in rage when he faced Lionel. So this was the first time he noticed that Lionel's divine armor was actually of the life grade. How was that possible? At that moment, Lionel's body expanded, rising to over 3 meters tall, and gaining an additional 2 pairs of arms and a pair of heads. Activating his panda construct, Lionel unleashed his starry spirit domain. In that moment, his internal sight was swapped for his dream world, and the world became countless times clearer. Ramon's invisible dream domain came into sight and Lionel could sense the distortions. This time when Ramon punched forward, Lionel punched out with a free hand himself, meeting knuckle to knuckle. Boom. They both took a single step back, their forearms trembling. Ramon's eyes narrowed beneath his visor. He didn't know what had changed, but he too could sense a shift in the atmosphere. He immediately deduced that Lionel had deployed a domain as well, likely a sensory one. Even so, Ramon was unmoved as he pushed forward again, his single fist suddenly becoming 2, then 3. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he brandished his spear, striking out once and yet meeting all 3 fists at the same time. But to his shock, all 3 spear blades missed and Ramon's fist appeared before him again. That was when Lionel realized that this couldn't just be a distortion of dream force. His affinity in dream force was too high and he couldn't be so easily tricked. There was an underlying spatial force that Ramon had only just unleashed. Lionel's divine armor cracked and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, his body trembling as his heels left a deep trench in the ground. By the time he looked up, Ramon was already before him once again, bearing down with a fierce momentum. Lionel could practically see 2 red irises behind the latter's visor. Lionel coughed again and took a break. He activated his starry star domain, and then his lotus domain, his battle intent soaring. His ideas of going easy on Ramon seemed like nothing more than a joke now. This was the Air Wars, this was an heir of the Morales family, weakness didn't run through them. The lines of dream force and spatial force became clear in Lionel's eyes. Pushing his lotus domain to the limits, he stripped Ramon of his spatial force, and made use of the time force that it produced to strengthen the unpredictability of his blade. But at that moment, a third force descended from Ramon's domain. Chapter 1977. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1977. A genius. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1977. A genius. Lionel was certain after a single look. It was breaking force, the very force designed to break rules and surpass expectations, the very force known for shedding limits and shattering them. At that moment, Lionel's lotus domain overloaded and crumbled. It didn't seem capable of fathoming an opposing force to breaking force. The 3 layers of Ramon's forces came together, and his fists suddenly blotted out the skies. They came from all directions and no direction at the same time. It overloaded Lionel's senses, almost as though he didn't have enough minds to finish the calculation. But that was absolutely impossible. No matter how powerful Ramon was, he couldn't possibly form millions of variables, and Lionel had at least that many minds. There was only one explanation. The breaking force was impeding his calculation ability. Lionel was almost never impressed. His standards were exceptionally high, and he thought even higher of himself. He didn't tend to be impressed by things he felt that he could do. But this divine armor of Ramon's. What a genius! Lionel felt another fist crash into his chest. Half of his panda construct was ripped to shreds, and the remaining impact collided with him, dealing him the worst injury he had suffered since entering the Air Wars. Heavy breathing forced Lionel to swallow more blood than he would have liked. Half of his body hung out from his panda construct, his chest a mess of flesh. This Ramon sure was interesting. He was the most inconspicuous, but if not for Lionel, the odds of him winning these Air Wars were exceptionally high. Lionel felt the most pressure from Adderworth, but after interacting with Ramon, he felt that it should actually probably be a 50-50 split between the two of them. He had really run into a buzzing chainsaw this time. Let alone Lionel. Even Valerie was very much surprised. She didn't know much about Ramon's combat strength because he never fought. He was famously still a galaxy-ranked disciple despite being in the 7th dimension, because he refused to battle to this extent. However, it could be said that this wasn't a display of combat strength per se. This was a display of his magnum opus, the craft he had poured the most blood, sweat and tears into, his divine armor. Crush your badge and apologize to my wife later, and I will let you go, Ramon said coldly. Lionel couldn't help but laugh inwardly. The whole apology to his wife later was clearly Ramon's attempt to save some face for Lionel. He knew that Human Domain was watching, and forcing Lionel to apologize for what was effectively him doing what he should be doing was too much. Despite his situation, Lionel found it a bit adorable. He definitely didn't have the capability of being so level-headed. If someone had shattered Aina's arm, even if she could practically instantly heal it, he would have probably lost his mind. Morales or not, the suffering of whoever had done it would be great. I will let you know that I haven't brought out my full strength. Even without my spear, I still have my other trump cards and my ability index. You've done well enough, don't force my hand. Lionel suddenly took a deep breath, causing raging winds to surge forward from all directions. The violent vortex ruffled both Lionel and Ramon's hair. Ramon's gaze narrowed as Lionel's injuries seemed to heal in practically the blink of an eye. In just a few seconds, his blood was trickling down from smooth and unblemished bronze skin. A rushing aura surged out from Lionel, and the rest of his panda construct shattered as he fell from within it and landed on the ground. He shook his head, pointing his spear down toward the ground as the bronze aura around him suddenly began to tremble, becoming slowly brighter and brighter. Noted, Lionel said lightly. Batum. Lionel's heartbeat was like a roaring beast, echoing over the city and causing a wild earthquake. But I still have a few tricks up my sleeve as well. At that moment, Lionel's halo suddenly expanded and began to trail down the length of his body. Ramon and those watching couldn't help but frown. Lionel should have already taken out his divine armor before. How could a trump card be something you have already taken out already? But right then, what should have been something they had already seen before became something decidedly different. The design of the armor was entirely different. With every movement, its joints and valves expanded and contracted. It looked almost like a living, breathing creature. While it carried the same pearly white and jade green colors, it also had an added black accent to it that made it look decidedly more dark and powerful. As the first streams of vital star force slowly closed the distance toward it from Lionel's vital star, the world seemed to fall into silence. When the streams finally entered the armor, rumble. A piercing light howled into the skies. Lionel opened his arms wide. The amount of vitality coursing through his body made him feel wide awake. It felt as though he could shatter the world with a single step. Lionel raised his foot and Ramon's pupils constricted instantly. The latter retreated, ready to expand the distance, but Lionel had somehow already appeared before him. Bang! Ramon didn't even realize when Lionel's fist had landed on his abdomen. He only vaguely noted that his divine armor had shattered to pieces. Lionel quickly retracted his fist, feeling that he would have pierced right through Ramon's stomach in that moment. However, his mercy is exactly what caused Ramon's body to shoot out like an iron ball from a cannon, streaking through the air with such speed that a harsh whistling sound filled the air. Lionel landed lightly on the ground, looking forward. He didn't seem surprised by the result at all, but the same couldn't be said for the remainder of the human domain. No one seemed to know how to respond. Lionel had taken out a second life-grade divine armor. Chapter 1978. Published at 3rd of July, 2023. 8:21 and 34 seconds AM. Chapter 1978. Big difference if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. 1978. Big difference. Lionel took a breath and exhaled. The gap between the strengths of his divine armors were enormous. Vital Star Force was a high-level force, and maximizing its usage required materials that were equally as high-level. Just now, Lionel leapt from a pseudo-life grade of the 4th dimension to one of the 5th dimension. The gap didn't need to be described. Ramon's domain was only as solid as the defenses of his divine armor, and was only as useful as the weakness of his enemies. While Lionel didn't have a way to counter it, there was always the most obvious method remaining: absolute strength. Lionel felt a glare on him, and he looked toward it to find Valerie, who had already stumbled to Ramon's side. He could only sigh. What else was he supposed to do in this situation exactly? Luckily, Valerie seemed to understand and shook her head. Looking around, she knew they had lost. It would take several days, maybe even weeks, for Ramon's divine armor to repair itself. And it had clearly been his greatest trump card. They didn't have any more chances. With a sigh, Valerie found the badge in Ramon's chest pocket and crushed it. Very quickly he, as well as all of his subordinates, vanished. The sounds of battle came to an end, but Lionel looked up toward the skies with a frown. Usually, he would keep his starry spirit domain activated at all times. His dream world gave far sharper clarity, and was much less easily fooled than his internal sight. So it was a no-brainer so long as he had the stamina. However, when he entered the air wars, he had kept it in reserve. The first reason was because while he could hold it up with great ease in the outside world, there was a great suppression here that drained him quickly, especially when he used Dream Force. The second reason was because the range wasn't large enough to give him a huge advantage regardless. His internal sight was 10 kilometers, but his dream world only extended for 100 meters now. When he used his second-tier divine armor, though this range expanded to just over a kilometer, though the range of his internal sight remained the same. Just now he had caught a whiff of something his internal sight had missed. Those resonating strings. Libra family, huh? Lionel had learned quite a bit by reading what the Void Library had to offer. In return, he had a surface to mid-level understanding of every prominent lineage factor in the human domain, and even some of other races from what wars and battles had gathered. When he saw the faint string of linked soul force, he recognized it immediately. He also wasn't surprised. Since he had known about their abilities, he also had guessed that they would use it like this. Lionel's lips suddenly curled and he flickered and vanished. His speed was ridiculous, leaving a trail of blue in his wake, as his figure was almost impossible to track with the naked eye. He had appeared before the Libra family members before they even understood what was happening. He reached out, grabbing their head. They immediately tried to fight back, but if even Ramon couldn't withstand a single strike, how could they? They found their legs dangled in the air as their arms squirmed about, but no amount of punching or kicking seemed to do a thing. If Lionel's first armor had sturdy defenses, this one was practically an impenetrable wall. The Libra family member felt as though they were punching against the wall, and suddenly, they felt nothing. Lionel shattered their neck with a single squeeze. Why would he waste time interrogating a living person when he could take everything he needed from their soul with much greater ease? Resume the connection with your sibling, Lionel commanded. Yes. The Libra family member reacted almost too eagerly, but this was simply the power of the King's Might lineage factor. With a flicker, Lionel vanished, and killed yet another Libra family, just as they were grieving the loss of their brother. The change was abrupt, and it seemed to happen without cause. Even now, those watching had yet to recover from the appearance of a second life-grade armor, when the two had died in quick succession. The Libra family elders were standing close with the Gamine family members. They were worried about Lionel's display, but they felt that their people were in a good position. With their experience, the things that the heiress of the Gamine family had deduced, they had as well, so they knew that Lionel shouldn't last much longer. But this sudden change had caught them completely off guard. This wasn't the first time they had seen this ability of Lionel's, but the visceral disgust they felt toward seeing it in this light was like a punch to the gut. Watching a grieving sibling suddenly begin groveling at the feet of the man who would have otherwise felt great hatred for moments ago. They felt shivers down their spines. Ramon and Valerie had just appeared in the range of the Morales family members, and were quickly taken in. When they saw that Lionel was actually slaughtering people, their expressions changed once more. While they knew Lionel had been merciful with them, seeing his ruthlessness painted a completely different picture. Lionel, though, didn't seem to care about this at all. He had already warned these people once. Their shivers, their disgust, if anything was only able to make him sneer. Lionel stood before the two constructs for a moment before waving his hand and sending them away. His conversation with them seemed to be brief, but he also seemed to be satisfied with it. His figure vanished once more, and when he appeared again, he had already taken the core of Ramon's city and begun to move forward, his divine armor fading. It was interesting. One of the main reasons he chose to use his lower-level divine armors, first outside of hiding his strength for the moment, was due to the stamina drain he knew they would have. But to his surprise, it wasn't very taxing at all. That was when Lionel remembered there was a big change between now and when he had created his divine armors. His metal synergy lineage factor was currently 8th dimensional. Lionel's lip curled. Chapter 1979. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 31 seconds AM. Chapter 1979. Time. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1979 time. There's not much time left. Lionel thought for a moment. There was only a few hours left before his soul constructs would vanish. The current progress was worthwhile. He had taken out 2 constellation families, arguably 2 that would have been the most threat to him during the late game. In addition, he had dealt with a hidden ace like Ramon as well before he could build up any more momentum. The strength of Ramon's army wasn't to be underestimated. Even after the battle had gone on for so long, only a few of them had suffered casualties, while the amount of Dream Force Lionel had wasted reconstructing the soul constructs was more than he wanted to think about. If Ramon had been able to build an army of millions or even tens of millions like Lionel estimated most of the heirs would be capable of during the waning days of the Air Wars, and he had outfitted them all with gold-grade armors and weapons, their momentum would have been truly devastating. Gold-grade treasures didn't seem like a big deal, but it had to be understood that only the richest of 7th-dimensional existences would have one or a few to supplement their battle prowess. Existences like Lionel who could pull out life-grade items were few and far between. At the moment, Lionel simply didn't have the resources to outfit everyone with gold-grade items. He could only spare such expenses for the best of his subordinates. And unfortunately, the segmented cube couldn't create life-grade items in his stead either. Its current limit despite being in the 8th grade was the gold grade. As for why this was, Lionel was actually sure of the details. There was likely something special about the life grade that required a human touch, or an extreme level of precision the segmented cube couldn't seem to match. This was all to say that Ramon would have been a true problem if he was given any more time. If it wasn't for James and the others, even Lionel's soul construct army would have been run over. However, that begged another question. Was Ramon the only heir here? Lionel felt that the odds of that were very small. There were 7 of them, and he highly doubted that Ancestor Hito would only place 2 of them on a single supercontinent. Of course, there was the possibility that with random placement, things had just ended up that way, but Lionel still felt a hint of caution. He had a vague map of the supercontinent in his mind. After he had tried to claim the entire continent through expanding his territory, he had picked out several strongholds. From his numbers, there should only be 2 such strongholds left along with dozens of others much smaller territories. The issue was that the 2 strongholds should already be accounted for. One, as he had just found out, should be the Libra family. As for the other, it should be the Gamine family, as he had also just found out. With his scope of understanding, there shouldn't be a third force hiding on the supercontinent. There simply wasn't enough land for a third to appear, especially when the Gamine and Libra, as he had once again just found out, were in cahoots with one another. All the territory between them was practically a no-man's land. In fact, they had only separated their territories as such for the sake of keeping up appearances, and not letting the cat out of the bag too soon. Lionel didn't seem to be spending much thinking power on the Libra and Gamine families at all. He was entirely focused on where the next Morales would appear from, and maybe that was because of the impact Ramon had had on him. There were only 2 explanations for the lack of Morales here. Either he was wrong and the other 5 Novas had truly appeared on the other continent, or from the very start there was someone bold enough to head directly into the ocean. As for whether there was a third possibility or not, Lionel didn't have enough information to make a claim. There's another failure up ahead. James' voice drifted to Lionel's ears. As James had said not long later, the group came across a barren village that had failed in the midst of its bronze grade upgrade challenge. They had come across quite a few of these. It was possible to tell they had failed because the bronze grade walls had formed, but had collapsed. In addition, their city core was cracked. These cracked city cores had a bit of value. You could fuse 3 cracked city cores into one to form a complete territory. It was an almost useless, secondary rule as it was probably only useful to those who had failed 3 times in a row and wanted a 4th opportunity. But by that point, they would have already been out of the race, so there was no point. Another option would be to repair it, but it cost double the upgrade challenge you had failed. There were no corpses to find in failed territories like this one since the heir in charge of it had probably already crushed their badge when they saw that the situation was bad. What needed to be questioned though was why such weak people would enter the air wars to begin with. If Lionel was correct, they were probably from fringe 7th-dimensional families. They probably even had 6th-dimensional individuals in the midst as well. What needed to be questioned though was why such weak people would enter the air wars to begin with. If Lionel was correct, they were probably from fringe 7th-dimensional families. They probably even had 6th-dimensional individuals in the midst as well. Lionel might have made it look easy, but even geniuses at Tier 9 of the 6th dimension weren't supposed to be able to fight against even the weakest 7th-dimensional existence. These people had truly overestimated themselves by participating at all. Lionel casually swiped the cracked territory core before moving onward. We won't be able to make it to the Libra and Gamine families. There's not enough time. This has been fruitful enough. It's time to turn back, Lionel suddenly said. The others nodded. They were beginning to feel a bit of fatigue as well. It had already been a near half-day since they set out, and they had been battling and marching since. The suppression of these air wars was truly unforgiving. The army of soul constructs and Lionel along with his brothers and subordinates prepared to turn back. However, at that moment, the ground began to rumble. Lionel's gaze narrowed as he looked into the distance. More chapters coming. Chapter 1980. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 26 seconds AM. Chapter 1980. Retreat. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1980. Retreat, Lionel said calmly. He took a glance at the distance just a single time before turning away. With a leap, he landed on Little Blackstar's back, his expression calm. In the distance, an army led by Juan Droit, Hewlett, Druid, and most obviously Kiza had appeared. They rode on the backs of beasts that were all quite shocking and powerful. So much so that although he had long since looked away, Lionel's eyes couldn't help but narrow. Lionel didn't recognize those beasts, but the people of the human domain most definitely did. Those were the very beasts that the Leo family had prepared beforehand, beasts that had given them a great advantage previously, but had suddenly now come under the control of the Gamine and Libra families. The Leo family's only choice was to be quite devastated about this. They were among the rare few that had 2 members of the Cataclysm generation with both Conan and Gunter, but neither of them were strategists and they were both quite simple-minded. In order to defeat them and claim their beasts, Kiza and the Libra twins only needed to defeat Conan. So long as Conan's badge was shattered, his beasts would be left behind. This was the difference between using a kill exchange for a beast and using points. If these beasts had been exchanged with kill exchanges, then they would have disappeared along with Conan and Gunter when they exited the air wars following their loss. The Leo family had used a loophole to gather a large amount of beast subordinates for just 1 point each. By the time Kiza had gotten to them, they had already gathered over 100,000 in this way. Normally, it should have been impossible for these beasts to so easily follow a new master like this, but the Gamine family had an advantage that the others didn't. And that was their comprehension of the soul. Controlling such low-talent beasts was actually extremely easy for them. Now, a great horde was charging after Lionel and the others. Lionel had thought that something like this might happen after he ran into the Libra twins. The 2 of them already had his general location, and they also had methods of relaying this information back, so that meant for as long as Lionel didn't notice, those 2 had probably been monitoring his movements. After they died and the connection was severed, The Libra and Gamine families had probably decided it was time to press forward. Those beasts. Their constitutions are weak, but they're all in the 7th dimension. It must have taken quite a bit of investment to do that. That's also a decent loophole to exploit as well. But those beasts shouldn't be native to the Gamine or Libra territories, so it must have been claimed from another family. The only families or organizations with enough capital to use this method have to be among the few most powerful. It could only be one of the constellation families. Why are you running, Great Emperor Lionel? You've seen me. Are you not going to kill me? Lionel's expression flickered. He recognized this voice. It was one of the Libra family twins that he had met during the true selection. His gaze became colder, but he didn't respond. The speed of the beasts the coming army charged with were not slow. They had just appeared over the horizon, but they were already rapidly closing the distance. Although it was true that if it wasn't for their inhuman abilities, even seeing or hearing one another would be impossible right this moment. This distance was still close enough for them to close within a quarter hour. The only reason Lionel had been able to cover so many hundreds of kilometers of territory to begin with was because of the speed of the 7th dimension. But now that very speed was coming back to bite him. There was no way for him to make it back to his own territory in that time. If he abandoned the soul constructs, their speed would be much faster, but they would still be caught. And if they were caught without the soul constructs present, well, that ending could be imagined. Little Blackstar was especially fast, but that was in his normal form. In this form, where he used his mimicry to imagine a much larger, more powerful creature, he wasn't even a tenth as fast. The best option seemed to be to stop and fight. Their army was just shy of 200,000 strong, and Lionel still outnumbered them greatly with things the way they were. However, Lionel abandoned that idea instantly. They weren't 200,000 strong, they were 400,000 strong. Each of them rode atop of beasts that multiplied their power. On top of that, half of them were Libra family members who were charging forth in tandem. When they worked together, their power was worth at least 3 people on the lower end, far more depending on their level of genius. This size of army was already enough to clash head-on with Lionel's soul construct army, and not lose out. These were true geniuses of the constellation families, a large segment of whom had made quite a name for themselves in the Void Palace. The Morales ancestors frowned when they saw this scene. They had already known that Lionel's actions were risky, and his timing of retreat wasn't bad either. The problem was that this Keys's timing was even better. She seemed to have been lounging around until she suddenly decided to pounce, even using a teleportation reward they had received from a dungeon to press their advantage and make sure they caught up. The Leo family had lost so miserably, and yet she had hardly needed to lift a finger. Now it looked as though Lionel was about to suffer the same fate. Even now, the young woman reclined in a sedan, sipping a drink as the twins continued to roar out derogatory comments. It seemed that the Libra and Gamine family were intent on ripping down all of the shock and all Lionel's actions had brought to this moment. If he ended up falling this way, running in his final moments, everything else would seem to have become meaningless. The man in question, though, continued to look forward, his gaze sharp. Chapter 1981. Published at 3rd of July, 2023, 8:21 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 1981. Monster and Pretty Flesh. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1981. Monster and Pretty Flesh. The distance between the group only continued to close. Lionel took a different direction, his mind flickering with several thoughts. It would be the end of the road if his group was pincered into 2 directions, so he was constantly ensuring that there wasn't a territory in the direction he was heading. But just as he expected, within a quarter hour, they had caught up. His calculations were too precise to get something so simple wrong, something that was quite unfortunate in this case. Lionel had already restructured his army. The moment they caught up, he sent out 100,000 to block. But to his surprise, Kiza waved a fan and the formation suddenly changed. The tide of beasts, Libra and Gamine family members split. 500 from the left and right surged forward, surrounding the group of 100,000 from the front and back, engaging in a battle 1,000 against 100 times their number. 2,000 if the beasts were counted as well. The reaction was swift and strong. Lionel's eyes narrowed. It was clear that Kiza had prepared for this possibility long ahead of time. 1,000 wouldn't be able to hold back the entire tide of 100,000, obviously. But they were strong enough to protect themselves even against such numbers. And they didn't need to delay for long. The maneuverability this group had with the help of these beasts was far beyond what Lionel had. This was proven by how easily they had changed formation and swallowed up the 100,000 Lionel had sent out. They didn't have to stop them for long, they only needed to outrun them. As expected, after delaying the soul constructs, the 1,000 who had blocked them rushed out, swiftly catching up with the rest of the Libra army and leaving the constructs in their dust. At the same time, the archers turned on the backs of their beasts, raising their bows high and firing volley after volley. There was already too big of a gap for Lionel's bow domain to suppress their bow force. But even if he was close enough, they were using real bows and arrows. Unless they had been aiming for him directly, he wouldn't be able to do anything to them. Lionel's soul constructs were mowed down one after another, and quickly lost 1/10 of their number. Lionel hesitated for a moment, but in the end decided not to use the stamina necessary to reconstruct them. Although they continued to run forward and dodge to the best of their ability, they were limited in what they could do against so many archers. It looked like even those not skilled in the bow were firing, something that could only mean one thing. Kiza had outfitted them with bows and arrows just for this occasion. The army swiftly caught up again. Lionel had no choice but to send out another 100,000 as a delaying tactic. However, this time they were prepared for the separation, splitting into two as well, and rushing toward the front line. Kiza waved her fan again, and the army that had just split into two split once again, dividing into four and curving around, repeating the very same action. Lionel's change in formation, although he could control the constructs with his mind whereas Kiza had to control them with singles, was simply not as fast. These beasts were relatively normal in strength in comparison to their tiers, but their speed was exceptional. In addition, while none of the heirs Lionel had come across were above Tier 3, these beasts all seemed to be. The weakest were at Tier 4 and the strongest were at Tier 6. Not only were they elite in speed, but even while they were average in strength, their tier was more than enough to make up for it. The army swiftly caught up once again in even less time than before. The archers continued to fire backward, but the pressure on Lionel's back was even more suffocating. Ha 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 ha. The laughter of Juan and Droit echoed through the air. They were told by Kiza to make this process as humiliating as possible, but even without her words, they would have done so anyway. Back during the true selection, they had suffered a small loss at Lionel's hands. As geniuses who were rarely challenged by anyone, they had a deep-seated pride. Seeing Lionel run away from them like this, they felt endless satisfaction. Keep running. Your Morales family only amounts to this much. You're a disgrace. I heard your father was some monster. How'd he birth such a coward? The words and laughter of Juan and Droit were especially grating on the ears to the Morales, but to the other families, especially the ones that had the words and laughter of Juan and Droit were especially grating on the ears to the Morales, but to the other families, especially the ones that had already lost their geniuses to Lionel's ruthlessness, couldn't help but feel that some of their rage was finally being vented. The only shame was that if things continued like this, they believed that Lionel would definitely crush his badge in time. There wasn't enough pressure on him to stop him from doing so. But his death could be arranged later. If they could guarantee his humiliation right now, they would gladly accept it. The only one who didn't seem happy about this was Conan. He looked toward Kiza with a livid expression, blood still dripping down from his lips. It should have been him. Slap. Conan grabbed the back of his head and looked back with a glare. However, when he saw who had slapped him, he looked down to the ground, gritting his teeth. It's your own fault you're in this situation. You're not strong enough to think that your fist can get you through everything. You should learn a thing or two from that woman. Better yet, it would be best if you asked for her hand in marriage. Conan shivered. Him. Spending a lifetime with a wife like that. He felt his heart grow cold. That woman was a monster in pretty flesh. Chapter 1982. Published at 7th of July, 2023, 12:10 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1982. Fool if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 1982. Fool Lionel's gaze was frighteningly cold. He sat on little black star's head in silence. His back as straight as a javelin. The only part of his body that seemed to be moving was his fluttering hair. As for the rest, even his eyes weren't blinking. It had been a long time since anyone had provoked him to this extent. The last time that had happened he was still a disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain. Of course, the words those few individuals had been speaking were far more sinister and disgusting. However, Lionel wasn't the type of person to take any sort of slight lightly. His patience was short, his fuse was shorter. However, at that moment, he didn't seem to have heard anything. The Libra and Gamine family couldn't gauge his reaction at all. All they saw was a perfectly straight back. Only the human domain could see the frigid air he was exuding. Those pair of pale violet eyes seemed to become the only sight worth witnessing for a moment. But after the fourth attempt Lionel made at stalling the army rushing after him. Even the impact of these cold eyes seemed to have been diminished greatly. What good was looking cold and imposing if you didn't have the strength to back it up? For a moralist to swallow such insults time and time again, running with their tail tucked between their legs, it could only be said that they didn't have any other left. The Libra and Gamine army swiftly caught up once again. This time, Lionel seemed to throw all he could at the wall. 500,000 soul constructs turned around and rushed toward them. They spread themselves thin, the deepest line only being at 3 soul constructs deep while many just had 2. Lionel's goal was obvious. He wanted to cover as much latitude as possible, so that the Libra and Gamine would struggle to maneuver to the right and left. However, when she saw this, Kiza's lip curled with disdain, her indifference almost palpable. This time, she didn't change the formation at all. Her fan simply snapped close and she pointed forward. Roars erupted from the Libra and Gamine army. They seemed to break out into a speed that was just about 10% faster as they surged forward. The archers turned their attention toward their backs and pointed their bows forward, unleashing a rain as the front line blasted through. This time, Kiza didn't bother to outmaneuver them. A formation as thin as this couldn't possibly stop them. They would slice through it like butter. Many could only shake their head at the sight, but they didn't know what else they would possibly try in this situation either. When Lionel tried to send out a real formation, Kiza would just outmaneuver it. If he sent out a hastily cobbled formation like the one just now, she would just target its weakness and tear through it. Every time they caught up, the air felt more suffocating, especially as the buffer of the soul constructs thinned out. 3 million soul constructs could take up a lot of space, but Lionel had sent out 3 waves of 100,000, and 1 wave of 500,000 for a total of 800,000 by now. With just another round of catching up, the archers would be close enough to target Lionel, and the few following him on little black stars back directly. Those observing within the human domain could also see that Lionel was no longer able to help his soul constructs restructure themselves after they had been destroyed. Considering the fatigue between his brows, that could only mean that his stamina was reaching its limits as well, while the Libra and Gamine families were entirely fresh. To make matters worse, what would Lionel even do if he managed to return to his city? He hadn't upgraded the walls like Ramon had, so they were just normal gold-grade walls that wouldn't last very long. Although he had those protectors, they too wouldn't last very long. His soul constructs were being mowed down one after another, so even if he tried to use that formation again, what good would it be if he didn't have soul constructs to use it with? And even if none of these were issues, did he even have the stamina necessary to use that formation again considering his current state? The observers knew more than the Libra and Gamine family did, so they knew about the Cloud race and Lionel's Tor family. But they weren't even in the picture currently and were too far away to ask for this. It was the most foolish. He had obviously acted in a complete panic. Do anything. A few Cloud race couldn't turn the tide at all. No matter how you looked at it, it seemed that Lionel was just trying to stretch out the inevitable. As though to confirm this, all of Lionel's remaining soul constructs suddenly turned back in unison, rushing toward the army in unison. Juan and Droit were stunned for a moment before their laughter became more uproarious. They could tell that this was a last-ditch effort. Although Lionel's previous attempts seemed pitiful, It was still the smartest thing he could have done considering the circumstances. As for this, it was the most foolish. He had obviously acted in a complete panic. Haha. Fool. Idiot. Kiza sneered without saying a word, raising her fan and unfurling it. At that moment, the army came to a halt all at once and performed 90-degree turns. Half turn to the left and another half turn to the right. They seemed to have completely ignored Lionel as they ran. They rushed to the side with great speed, circling around the charging army. Ironically, this tactic had indeed delayed the Libra and Gamine families for the longest period of time. But after they finished rounding the soul constructs, there would no longer be anything separating them from Lionel and the others. However, if Lionel had been patient, sending out sets of 100,000 at once, the cumulative time he could have delayed them would have been much greater. Clearly, in his desperation, he had only sealed his fate faster. Chapter 1983. Published at 7th of July, 2023, 12:10 and 22 seconds p.m. Chapter 1983. Belief. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Noah looked back with a worried glance. Until now, the so-called catching up of the army was only to the back line of the soul constructs. Considering there were over 3 million of them running in formation, the gap between them and Lionel, and the others who were on Little Blackstar's back was actually quite substantial. But this time, after they rounded the formation of soul constructs, there would be no buffer remaining. They would have no choice but to face an assault of hundreds of thousands with just a few dozen people. The outlook seemed to be incredibly bleak. When Noah looked around, he saw many worried gazes as well. Until now, everything had gone exceptionally smoothly, everything was under Lionel's calculations and nothing had deviated from the original plan. They had had many days booked solid with meetings before the air wars even began. Also that Lionel could assure them of his plans, and so that they would be ready to execute them at the greatest possible speed. Of course, the likes of Noah and the others didn't know how rare it was for Lionel to do such a thing. The fact that he had even wasted time explaining himself just went to prove how seriously he had taken these air wars. But the first time Lionel went off script, the first time he did something that could be considered to be quite risky, they seemed to be suffering for it. Noah's gaze shifted and his pupils suddenly constricted. The person in his line of sight was Aina. She looked completely calm outside of a bone-chilling coldness in her eyes. When his gaze shifted again, it landed on Lionel's brothers. Joel, Milan, Drake, Raj, Arnold, Gil, Alan and Franco. They too were eerily calm. It shifted again, and it landed on James. His gaze was different from the others, but that was only because within his sheen of calmness, there was a hint of excitement. Did they know something he didn't know? No, that was impossible. They had held all of their meetings together. Although it might have been possible for Lionel to have had secret meetings with them, Noah didn't believe that had happened. He had spent much of the last month with all of them, but more importantly than that, Lionel wouldn't do such a thing. Doing such a thing would be as good as saying he didn't trust the rest of them, but they were already a small group to begin with. In a situation where they faced off against the odds, Lionel wouldn't casually splinter them like that. Noah realized what it was very quickly: belief. Lionel hadn't said a word. He seemed to have made several mistakes. He had painted them into a corner. And yet these 10 individuals didn't doubt him for even a moment. When Noah looked again, he realized the few that had worried expressions were all the few geniuses of Earth. These were the likes of Carolus, Joyce, even Jessica, who was by his side. Without a doubt, each one of these people were among the few that had spent the least time with Lionel. Is it really about time? Noah thought to himself. If he was in this situation, would Jessica still have belief in him to succeed? What about Carolus and the others who had the most time with him? He had fought by their side for a long time, but he still didn't know the answer to that question. Hadn't there also been a 2-decade gap since Lionel had seen his brothers? Hadn't he even had a falling out with James? Maybe Aina's belief made sense, but what about the rest of them? Noah suddenly noticed that there was another group with unwavering belief: Raylion, Hephaestus, Sale and Emna. These few he knew too little about. He only vaguely understood that they had been a part of an organization Lionel had joined many years ago. They had even less reason to have such belief. But hadn't they already bet almost 30 years of their life betting on one man? Those four had started an organization and put their blood, sweat and tears into it for decades, all because of one sentence from Lionel. Compared to this, wasn't that something that had taken much more faith? Noah's heart trembled as he looked toward Lionel's back. He was this man's cousin and he didn't have this much faith. Where did it come from? What was the difference? Was it because he was too focused on himself? Were the others seeing something he wasn't? It seemed both obvious and not. Noah believed that Lionel was his better, but it was based on the latter's competency. When Lionel seemed to make a mistake, he felt that that competency had run its course, and that Lionel was now at the end of his rope. He never really stopped to consider that there was something more to Lionel than just his talent. When you measured people by haves and have-nots, you tended to reach very binary conclusions. Lionel had never been such a person, though. He felt that talent was extremely important, yes. But he also didn't decide a person's value by such a thing. And quite ironically, when one thought about it, when had Lionel ever thought that strength was the end-all, be-all? How many people more powerful than himself had Lionel defeated on his way to his current height? How many impossible battles had he fought? How many miracles had he created? At that moment, the rumbling of the earth reached a point where it couldn't be ignored. Noah looked back to see that the army had already finished rounding Lionel's soul constructs. They were no more than half a kilometer away, a distance that was practically meaningless. Lionel suddenly stood to his feet, calmly taking the white lion bow out and stretching it to full moon. His hair fluttered in the wind and the coldness of his gaze descended onto the approaching army. Chapter 1984. Published at 7th of July, 2023, 12:10 and 21 seconds p.m. Chapter 1984. Soulbound. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel looked down, with a frightening cold gaze, his expression the picture of calm. Kiza narrowed her eyes, but after a moment she relaxed. She didn't even put her defenses up. If Lionel thought he could mow her down from such a distance, he was sorely mistaken. She had already predicted that Lionel would try this. The last thing a person could do in this situation was to take out the heirs. That way victory could be secured despite a disadvantage. She had already used a similar strategy against the Leo family, so how could she fall for it now? Wouldn't that be too much of a joke? Kiza's fan snapped close once again, and her sedan seemed to sparkle. It was subtle, but it was impossible for Lionel's sharp vision to miss it. Although Kiza wanted to hide it, to her it wasn't absolutely necessary for it to be hidden either. Whether Lionel knew it was there or not hardly made a difference. However, she didn't know how true this was, because she was never Lionel's target to begin with. Neither were either one of the Libra twins. You finally want to fight back now? Juan's voice boomed. Tell you what, Lionel. If you admit the Morales family is trash, we can consider letting you go and giving you another chance. How about it? Droit added. Juan laughed. He felt these words said by his brother were truly excellent. His laughter was his agreement. Of course, this chance would only be another small head start before they swiftly caught up again. However, to them, it didn't really matter whether Lionel accepted their offer or not. Their goal only seemed to be to drag Lionel and the Morales family through the mud as much as possible before claiming their victory. They wanted the entire human domain to see and witness this moment. Thwack. The arrow was simply too fast. A soldier on the front lines didn't even have the time to react before their head burst into a rain of blood, bone and gore. His body slowly fell to the side, and was quickly trampled beneath the feet of the other charging beasts. This was the first of their army to have died since the battle began. The soul constructs couldn't shake them in the slightest, but it seemed that the moment Lionel moved, death reigned. Sishu. Thwack. Another arrow was released and another fell and was trampled. Every time Lionel pulled back his bowstring, another would die. None of the army knew who he was going to target next, but they all felt a formless pressure suddenly shrouding them. Somehow they knew at that moment that no matter what they did, so long as he decided to target them, they would be dead. It wasn't just the people who sensed the shift, but even the beasts themselves. Their blood seemed to run colder, their bones and muscles stiffening. Their speed fell. Though it was only by a small factor, To sharp-eyed practitioners like them, that slight delay was all too obvious. Lionel pulled his bowstring again, and another fell. It was just a single man attacking an army of hundreds of thousands. However, it was ironically this that made it so frightening. If it was an all-out battle and people were falling left and right, the situation would still be fine. But this oppressive atmosphere where no one knew who would be targeted next, and death seemed to be instant, filled each one of them with a seed of fear. Male or woman, ugly or beautiful, there didn't seem to be a rhyme or reason to his choices. In the beginning, Juan and Droit still tried to hurl out insults, but they noticed that every time they did, Lionel would release another arrow. It was as though Lionel was firing in retaliation for their words. Every death was slowly being transferred from Lionel's shoulders to that of the two of them. Their insults quickly became softer and less harsh, until suddenly they didn't dare to speak at all. Keys's eyes narrowed. Lionel could obviously kill more than one at once, but he hadn't done so. He was deliberately suppressing them in this way, and by this point, the humans and the beasts had stiffened so considerably that their speed had dropped by as much as 40%. However, after a moment, Keys sneered. Fear only worked when you had your own mind, and the current speed was dictated by the beasts under her control. She waved her fan, and a surge of force came out from her. At that moment, the eyes of the beasts glazed over, and they seemed to forget everything but running. Their speed picked up again almost immediately, and the distance that had begun to slowly widen began to close once again. By this point, there was already less than 200 meters between them. Lionel, though, seemed unmoved. Raising a hand, his gaze suddenly flashed. The beasts of the fallen Libra and Gamine family members were suddenly enveloped by a strong spatial force. Lionel had realized long ago that the reason Kiza was able to control the formation changes so smoothly was because she was in control of the beasts. Because of that, even after their riders had fallen, these beasts continued to run uniformly within the pack. And as a result, they were well within range of Lionel's abilities. The beasts instantly went from behind Lionel, and the others to in front. Kiza frowned. What was Lionel going to do with a few dozen beasts? He couldn't be this stupid, could he? At that moment, Little Blackstar raised his large paws and pressed down with great force. The dozens of beasts were slaughtered unceremoniously. Rise, Lionel said lightly. Kiza seemed to finally understand what was happening. She had the advantage in speed because of the beasts they were riding. Lionel wanted to use his soul constructs to take advantage of this for himself. Like this, it would be much more difficult for them to catch up. However, when she realized this, Kiza finally couldn't seem to hold her laughter back. She raised her pretty head and laughed heartily, the sound being far too sweet for the sinister intention behind it. In the crowd of those watching, a gorgeous woman wearing a sparkling purple dress that clung to her curves covered her cherry lips with a glass of wine. This woman seemed to be almost an identical copy of Kiza. She was none other than Mistress Gamine, the current matriarch of the Gamine family and Kiza's mother. What a little fool. For someone who uses soul constructs, shouldn't he understand? What good is killing this first if their souls are what are bound? Lionel raised his hand, suddenly feeling a great resistance against his command. Violet fog billowed out from him, but it seemed to be obstructed by invisible chains that he couldn't shatter instantaneously. However, in that moment, the coldness in Lionel's eyes seemed to reach its peak. If the others had paid more attention, they would have noticed that there was indeed a pattern to who he had killed. All of them had ridden Tier 6 beasts. This was his plan from the beginning, or more accurately, the first of it. As for these chains, a vortex of violet suddenly expanded out from Lionel's body. Emperor's edict. Shatter. Kiza's laughter came to an abrupt stop as a spike of pain traveled up her spine. Illusory shackles shattered like glass and dozens of beasts arose. Lionel and the others leapt down from Little Blackstar's back as the latter reverted to his true form and flickered into the void. Aina, Lionel said lightly. Aina nodded without much of a word. Chapter 1985. Published at 7th of July, 2023, 12:10 and 20 seconds p.m. Chapter 1985. Sundial. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Aina's golden gaze began to flicker. a dense red fog coming from her body as she raised her hands. The instant little black star's form vanished, and he landed on Lionel's shoulder even as the latter landed on the back of one of the soul construct beasts. The meat paste the beasts had become were suddenly ripped of their blood. She didn't seem intent on using these globules of blood immediately. She floated down toward the beast's soul constructs along with everyone else, pulling them along through the air. Keys's expression finally seemed to change. Fire! Her voice echoed through the skies, the irony being that her previous laughter had yet to finish echoing. However, she seemed to disregard this entirely as she roared out this command. Before, she was allowing the twins to continue to wear down Lionel with their words, but they had long since entered firing range of Lionel and the others. Seeing that the situation was changing, she immediately chose to forget the mind games and focus on pressing down upon them. However, when the first volley of arrows entered the skies, they immediately blinked out. The bow force that had been coating them vanished. James landed on a beast soul construct and waved a hand, causing a shield to appear before them. Without their bow force, he hardly strained at all to block this volley of arrows. In that moment, everyone had found a beast for themselves and they surged forward. Right then, the distance that had been quickly closing stopped closing entirely, and then Lionel and the others began to pull away. Lionel had only targeted Tier 6 beasts. In order to maintain the formation, Kiza had to make all the beasts uniform in speed. But that didn't mean they all had the same speed. Those that were Tier 6 were substantially faster than those that were still of Tier 4. Without the pressure of maintaining the formation of an army, Lionel could obviously allow these soul constructs to speed forward with their true potential. Kiza's expression darkened. Back in the human domain, Mistress Gemin's expression also darkened. This child's actions were only getting more and more annoying. However, outside of this darkening expression, she said nothing else. She had taught her daughter well enough to know that this wouldn't be all she had. The Morales ancestors didn't have much of a change from their original solemnity. Of course, this wasn't because they had the same faith in Kiza, but rather because they didn't feel that this changed much. Other than making things more annoying for Kiza, the situation was the same. Kiza's ambush had already forced Lionel to give up on his millions of soul constructs. His current base only had the protection of a few thousand Skies and Oryx members. Even if they were up to par in terms of talent, which they weren't, this number would be far too few. No matter how you looked at it, it felt that Lionel was once again just delaying the inevitable. Lionel stood on the back of the beast in silence. Outside of calling out Aina's name, he hadn't said much else. Even now he hadn't explained anything, and it didn't seem like there was much left to explain. Reaching their city and fighting to the death felt like the only option left. Kiza's looked toward Lionel's back, her expression dark. She didn't care about this maneuver of Lionel's. What she cared about was the loss of face. She had just been laughing, but now her voice was deathly silent. Even a fool could tell she had made a mistake. What she hated the most was that this Lionel had actually harmed her. When was the last time she had felt any sort of pain? She couldn't even quite recall. How dare he? After a split moment, she snapped her fan close. A few lines of the formation separated, and Tier 6 beasts rushed forward. She removed their restrictions and had them press forward, maintaining the distance between Lionel and the others without allowing them to extend the distance. Arrows continued to fire through the air, filling it with volatile force and fireworks. Kiza had had a plan, but it would no longer work. Now that Lionel had similar maneuverability, it would be troublesome to use. However, she immediately adjusted her thoughts, pulling out a formation plate. It was in the shape of a circle, and looked quite like a sundial. This was the very same teleportation treasure she had used to ambush Lionel and the others in the first place. She and the Gamine and Libra families were located on the other side of the continent, completely opposite to Lionel's current location. As such, they were also by the ocean, and with Kiza's intelligence she had likewise taken advantage. They might not have had a large number of water force geniuses, but what they did have was a unique ability to map out large regions with just a bit of effort. By this point, they had already cleared out 2 gold-grade dungeons not available on the surface, and this sundial teleportation device was one of their rewards. It didn't have many uses. She had already used it once, and because of how large-scale the teleportation was, meaning the number of people, that is, she could only use it twice more. She didn't actually want to have to use more than one of Lionel, as she didn't know when she would get another. However, he was a variable, and she didn't like variables. Her slender fingers pressed against the device and spun the dial. Instantly, she not only used one of the remaining teleportation opportunities, but both of them. The army was split into two, and they all suddenly flickered and vanished. One group was small. They were made of the elite, a number not exceeding 200. They appeared just 50 meters in front of Lionel and his group, though their backs were now facing them. With a kick of their heels, their beasts turned and they charged toward Lionel and his group. At the same time, about half of the army appeared further ahead at about half a kilometer. They split into two once again, and fanned out before beginning to enclose a circle around Lionel and the others. To their backs, the remaining half of the army continued to press forward, pincering Lionel and the others from all sides. Chapter 1986. Published at 7th of July, 2023, 12:10 and 17 seconds p.m. Chapter 1986. Crush them if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The change was sudden, and it was difficult to react. Lionel sensed the fluctuations of spatial force and realized what was happening. But even he only had the time to fire one arrow before the group of 200 elite were upon them. Lionel's gaze remained calm, his one arrow killing a frontline elite instantaneously. His body sprawled to the floor and his beast's eyes were coated and covered in blood. Kiza had no choice but to relinquish control of the elite squad beasts for a few reasons. First, she didn't want to suffer the backlash of Lionel severing their connection again. Secondly, she had to give the elite squad the freedom to maneuver on their own, or else their combat prowess would take a hit. However, it was also due to the fact that once the beast's eyes were obstructed by flesh and blood, it tripped and fell, causing disarray in the first line and ruining the back line. Unfortunately, the damage was minimal. These few had just turned around to face Lionel and the others, and as such their speed hadn't hit a great height just yet. Due to this, they had more than enough agility remaining to react and dodge out of the way. Even so, this small delay still gave Lionel some time to analyze and react. "Raj," he said plainly. Raj slammed his chubby hands together, his large cheeks rippling. The seriousness of his gaze was piercing as the ground rumbled. Lionel knew firsthand that the hardest force to manipulate in a powerful world was Earth Force. It had been one of his greatest limitations back when he was at Void Palace. But this wasn't the Void Palace. Raj was in the 7th dimension, and he also wasn't the same as before. He had fought many rounds with the Perfection Stone, and he had meditated on the Earth Force mantra for more hours than he could remember. Bang! The earth rippled and suddenly hardened. Spikes of shimmering diamond and crystal collapsed and fused out from the ground before surging up and ripping through the disorganized group of elites. Blood rained down from the skies above, and Lionel led his small group to charge up the side of these crystalline spikes. They burst out from the curtain of blood, leaping over the small troop of elites and landing dozens of meters away. The soul constructs dashed forward, but up ahead, the encirclement of warriors had already solidified. It seemed that Kiza was already prepared for this possibility. Not only was there a blockage ahead, but the elites would likely recover quite quickly as well. Lionel slowly put his bow away, retrieving his black rod. Dense, dark fog billowed from its body, rising like a tide and forming a menacing blade on both ends. Despite the movement of the beast beneath his feet, Lionel seemed completely stable. "James Raylion." Lionel spoke calmly. James swung the large shield that protected their backs forward and expanded it, his gaze flashing with a strong light. Then he pushed it forward with all his might. At the same time, Raylion raised his hands. A powerful telekinetic force took shape and fused with James' forward momentum. Like a mighty battering ram, the shield smashed into the front line of warriors. The Libra and Gamine family didn't remain idle. They roared themselves, sending forward the strongest strikes they could muster in short order. However, to their shock, James' barrier only trembled one or twice before it stopped completely. The speed with which James could move his barriers depended on how thick they were. Usually, to make a barrier this thick he would have to give up on its agility. However, with Raylion supporting from the back, bang, bang, bang. In unison, Raylion and James' eyes flashed. The forward momentum of the barrier tilted, the bottom leaning forward and its top leaning back. After throwing the front line off balance and clearing them, many couldn't stop themselves from rolling up the energy shield, their beasts thrown into disarray as their bones snapped and cracked. Drake, Lionel said lightly. Drake pulled a pair of pistols of his holsters, raising both of his hands up as what looked like crosshairs rotated in his eyes. A blazing intent pumped his heart as he began to shoot. Every time someone was thrust over the energy shield he fired. One shot. One kill. Lionel brandished his spear with one hand and used his free hand to scratch little Blackstar's head. The latter seemed to wake up from his slumber and vanished from Lionel's shoulder. Lionel shifted to the side of the formation. At the same time, Joel mirrored his actions. Both of them took hold of their polearms, their battle intent soaring as they swung out. Around the edges of the energy shield, enemies tried to wrap around and target the sides of their formation, but they didn't have the momentum to make any strong headway. Every time one managed to make it around, they would find the end of Lionel or Joel's blade, their bloodied and mangled corpses being left in their wake. It hardly seemed as though Lionel and the others had slowed down at all. The gap that had been about 200 meters had only shrunk to about 180 or so. Although it was still somewhat closing as some loss of speed was inevitable, it was nowhere as fast as it should be. Lionel gave out command after command, and the army of Libra and Gamine were being shredded to pieces. His voice became like the call of the Reaper, the collapse of the guillotine, a suffocating, omnipresent pressure. He didn't need to speak at all to relay these orders, and yet he had done so. Every time that soft, calm voice echoed, dozens would fall. Even so, the distance continued to close and the fatigue of the small group was only continuing to accumulate. Daylight seemed so close and yet so far away. The line of enemies was too thick, and there was only so much Lionel and Joel's polearms could do. The moment they slowed to a certain point, being swallowed from all sides was the only result. Kiza's eyes flashed. It's about time you four took action. Crush them. The two pairs of Libra family twins' eyes narrowed, slowly retrieving their weapons. Indeed, it was about time to end this. Chapter 1987. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 1987. Meaningless if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Juan and Droid, along with Hewlett and Druid, surged forward. However, what was odd was that although they both seemed to be running hard, only one of each twin suddenly sped forward. Their speed so fast that they overtook their own beasts and caught up with Lionel and the others in what felt like an instant. Lionel didn't turn back, but he could already sense the change. He knew what this was. The twins could share their strengths between one another. In exchange for one being much slower, the other could become much faster in an instant. At that moment, Juan and Hewlett pulled at their waists, taking out a pair of rope darts. The rope twirled around their bodies before piercing forward with a fierce momentum. Kiza had been observing all the while. She had realized that although Lionel was constantly handing out orders, there were some among the group that he didn't give orders to. At the same time, these few he didn't give orders to also seemed to have the worst expressions and reactions to the situation. She was a person quite used to playing with and manipulating the minds of others. How could she not sense this crack in Lionel's armor? As such, the moment she ordered the four forward, she told them exactly who to target. Most of Lionel's group seemed to just be along for the ride, and even with Lionel's small victories, their expressions remained solemn. These sort of weak links deserved to be poked and prodded at. The rope darts whistled through the air, their speed faster than any whip and overtaking even an arrow in the blink of an eye. Juan's dart appeared before Joyce while Hewlett's appeared between careless brows. The harsh whistling stung their eyes, and they couldn't seem to react in time. At that moment, Noah unleashed a roar, leaping up and swinging down his saber hard. Bang! Bang! A strong reverberating impact traveled up Noah's arm. He wanted to use the momentum of the clash to return to his beast and continue speeding forward, but the twins seemed to see through him. Their rope darts turned from a feeling like a piercing arrow to becoming as live and gentle as flowing silk. They wrapped around Noah's saber and pulled. Noah noticed the change instantly and wanted to pull back, even ultimately choosing to abandon his saber, but it was too late. That split moment between their twins' pull and his release slowed his momentum far too much. He fell well short of his beast's back, landing heavily on the ground, weaponless and suddenly surrounded by enemies. Noah's gaze sharpened, and he roared immediately. He didn't hesitate at all to activate his ability index and soar to over 5 meters tall, his skin glistening with a crystalline color as he hardened it. He leapt backward with as much strength as he could muster, punching out twice, then thrice. The twins' gaze narrowed, but they had already succeeded. Their rope darts soared to the skies but entirely backward. At the same time their twins, still stuck trying to catch up, threw their own rope darts forward. The ends of their rope darts wrapped around one another and locked into place across hundreds of meters of air. With a tug, Juan and Hewlett pulled Droid and Druid through the air. With one swift motion, Juan and Hewlett used the drag to pull back from the strongest impact of Noah's punches as the latter's saber clanged to the ground. At the same time, they sent Droid and Druid forward, the two of them appearing before Noah's in the blink of an eye. Bang! Bang! The two twins kicked out against Noah's chest. He might have been more powerful in this state, but he was also a much bigger target. Noah felt his skin crack and his organs rumble. He took heavy steps backward, blood already leaking from his lips after a single exchange. Droid and Druid's rope darts untangled from Juan and Hewlett's. The instant they landed on the ground, their wrists flickered, their rope darts whistling through the air with a harsh whistle. One targeted Noah's heart while the other targeted his knee. Kiza watched this from the distance with a cold smile gracing her cherry lips. Her sedan continued to move forward at a smooth pace, almost as though she didn't care about catching up at all. She was content to watch her chess pieces move across the board. This was what thrilled her. It didn't matter what move Lionel made now. Would he ignore Noah? Sure, he could do that. But then the fragmentation between him and the discontent half of his subordinates would only increase. That would only make it even easier for her to take advantage of these problems. Would he turn back to save him? Even better. Then he could forget about charging out of this encirclement entirely. Kiza had only just finished this thought when a little black mink suddenly flickered into existence, landing on Noah's shoulder. Yip! Yip! Noah tried to block, but he suddenly stood in shock as the rope darts phased through his body as though he wasn't there at all. His body only slightly rippled, and he felt a breeze of cold air as though a draft had suddenly come by. Droid and Druid pulled their rope darts back, their eyes filled with hints of surprise. What had just happened? Kiza raised an eyebrow. Shadow Sovereign? A little interesting but meaningless. The trap is already prepared to close. As Droid and Druid were somewhat in shock, Hewlett and Juan had already jumped back into the fray, their rope darts spiraling toward Joyce and Carolus once again. This time, there was no Noah to cover for them. Carolus' body erupted with a strong spatial force, the space around him cracking like glass as he punched out. Space coated his knuckles, but the instant the rope dart met his attack, he was sent flying backward. Chapter 1988. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 1988. Bonus. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Joyce's expression changed as well. She was a fist expert, but without having her feet beneath her, the strength she could muster was limited. Seeing Joyce in trouble, Franco had long since moved. Just when it seemed her head would be pierced through, he had jumped from the back of his beast onto hers, reaching out to grab the rope dart out of the air. Hewlett sneered, her usually pretty features looking quite sinister at the moment. Trying to grab her weapon? Did he have a death wish? Franco's body shuddered as he made contact, his entire arm going numb. He was blown backward, his body landing amidst their running beasts and rolling onto the ground. Franco! Joyce leapt down without hesitation. Suddenly, it wasn't just Noah who was caught in a no-man's land. Joyce, Carolus and Franco had all been knocked from their beasts, stuck in the midst of two charging armies. As though this wasn't bad enough, the small troop of elites they had left behind had swiftly caught up. and were now bearing down as the first wave. Kiza smiled, swirling the wine glass in her hand. She and her mother took a long sip at the same time, their hearts filled with the sweet feeling of victory. What they liked the most was to watch their enemies writhe beneath their fingers, unable to extricate themselves. Lionel's expression was frighteningly cold. He had been occupied with the charging army and couldn't easily extricate himself. By the time he could, the damage was done. His spear whipped outward, a light roar clearing the surrounding 5-meter space as he turned back without hesitation. Whether it was for his cousin or his brother Franco, how could abandoning them ever be a choice? By this point, Druid and Droid had recovered from the shock of Noah's survival. They flicked their wrists, one of them targeting the little mink, and the other targeting Noah. So long as they fused their attacks with enough force, phasing through them wouldn't be so easy. As expected, Little Blackstar had no choice but to leap forward, brandishing his little claws as he sliced down with several dark force scythes to block. Noah prepared to take on Droid's strike, but he suddenly coughed. The damage of the previous kicks he had taken head-on were taking their toll. But then, not only had Druid and Droid kicked him, but they had amplified their strength through Juan and Hewlett. He couldn't gather up any strength without his entire body shuddering. He could only watch with despair as the rope dart approached. But right then, his despair turned quite savage. There was little he felt that he could control in his life right now, but he could at least die without being a coward. He roared out, his body expanding to 10 meters. Ignoring the pain, he punched out with everything he had, his momentum overbearing. Even so, bang! Noah's entire right arm shattered and he was sent flying back. Lionel swiftly caught up, catching Noah as his body shrunk. At this moment, his expression wasn't just cold, it was frighteningly dark. The air rippled around him, combusting and collapsing. The group couldn't possibly continue forward without Lionel. The moment they saw that he had turned back, they did so as well. They were his brothers, and then there was his Aina. How could any one of them leave him behind? The army bore down from all sides, clamping until there was no direction to go. Whether it was forward, backward, to the left or to the right, there was nothing to see but a sea of Libra and Gamine family members. The night air was suffocatingly humid. The blood and sweat of countless warriors made it heavy and difficult to breathe. There were no steps left to take. High up, the Morales ancestors could only sigh. Though it was valiant that Lionel hadn't hesitated to turn back. It seemed that this choice had actually sealed his fate. Kiza waved her fan gently, relishing in the breeze as her sedan slowly caught up. The foul stench of blood and sweat didn't seem to ruin her appetite at all. In fact, it only seemed to make her wine taste all the sweeter. Her beasts rose her sedan into the air, giving her an excellent view. Seeing Lionel and the others encircled in this fashion, her smile only became brighter. "No longer running?" she asked lightly. Lionel didn't respond. He seemed to be checking on Noah, but there really was nothing to check. While his life wasn't in danger, for now, his ability to fight was likely shot. At least that was the case before Lionel's palms began to glow with a strong light force. Interesting, Kiza smiled, seemingly indifferent to Lionel's disregard. What good was acting cool and aloof when you had lost before the eyes of everyone? Indeed, you have the capital to be calm. Even for me, I can't stop you from crushing your badge and giving up right this moment. Though you might lose face for wagging your tongue harder than your fists, losing a bit of face is definitely better than dying. Kiza nodded to herself. At this point, Juan and Droid didn't even bother to pile on. Nothing they could say could ever be as sinister as what this woman's venomous tongue could conjure up. But it is a shame. I was looking forward to what a horse spawn could do. I didn't expect you to be so pathetic. Kiza tipped her wine glass over the side of her sedan with an expression of disgust. The blood and gore didn't seem to bother her, but these words seemed to have left a disgusting taste in her mouth. No, it wasn't the words, but rather the mention of that person. I should have known that a woman only good for enticing the husbands of others wouldn't have any redeeming qualities, but it's as the saying goes, we all have our vices. Your mother's vice just happens to be far more disgusting than most others. The more she spoke, the deeper the disgust on Kiza's face seemed to become. It was as though she was recalling everything she hated in an instant. I can't stand the look of his face anymore. Kill him or get him to quit and run with his tail tucked between his legs. I can't be bothered to care anymore. About here should be good. Lionel spoke lightly as he stood to his full height, fresh blood falling from his blade as though it couldn't be tarnished. What did you say? Kiza sneered. Rumble. The ground began to tremble and a formation suddenly rose out from the ground, forming a dome over the surroundings. Suddenly, those watching from the outside all had changed expressions. That location. Wasn't it where Lionel's original city used to be? At that moment, a realization overcame them. Lionel had added his formation separately. It wasn't part of the city. When he used the city relocation reward, it had only moved the city itself, not what was around it. In this battlefield filled with dried ground and rubble, buried beneath it was a perfectly pristine formation. Lionel finally looked up after Noah could breathe smoothly without his aid. However, his gaze carried a fiendish air. Crimson flickered in his eyes, a demonic aura billowing out from him in waves. He met Kiza's gaze for the first time since the chase had begun. I'm going to enjoy killing you. Chapter 1989. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 1989. Ashif audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Kiza's heart skipped a beat, her pupils constricting. However, after a moment, she slowly managed to calm down. She realized what was happening and made the same deductions as everyone else a step quicker. She didn't know a lot about this formation. Although she had been monitoring Lionel, all this time using Libra family twins, the level of clarity their methods could bring was limited. While they could cover very large regions, and their methods were difficult to detect, there was a trade-off that came with that as well. Even so, she knew enough to know that this formation was the formation that Lionel had used to clear the gold grade trial, and also further knew that he needed soul constructs to make use of it. Even though many had died in this battle, they were ultimately just a drop in the bucket. They weren't nearly enough to turn the tide. In addition, she had seen through this formation's obvious weakness. It only worked within the bounds of the formation itself. Even if Lionel had some other trick up his sleeve, it would only take a slight step out to deal with this situation. That didn't even mention the fact it greatly drained Lionel. Not only was their army stronger than a 3 million strong gold grade tide, Lionel was already feeling hints of fatigue. How long could he possibly use the formation? All of these matters made Kiza sneer, but right then, all she saw in Lionel's eyes was disregard. He looked at her not like an enemy, not like a beauty, not like a peer, but rather like a lamb on a chopping block. She wasn't just an annoyance, she was an inferior life form. Despite the fact she had the high ground, it felt as though she was already being trampled beneath his feet. Lionel took out 3 crack city cores and pressed them together at the same time. One had failed a silver grade upgrade while 2 had failed a bronze grade upgrade. Taking the silver grade upgrade failure as their core, they combined into a new bronze grade village core. Before anyone could wonder what Lionel was doing, he had already swept through and accepted the silver grade upgrade challenge. Kiza's expression changed. That was impossible. According to the rules, an upgrade challenge couldn't be triggered when there were a number of enemies within a certain distance of your territory. She couldn't understand how Lionel could even accept the upgrade when it shouldn't have been available in the first place. But even so, what was the point of this? A realization overcame Kiza, but it was already too late. Lionel's finger flickered and just as the tide formed, a bolt of lightning descended from the skies, killing them all. He had activated a silver grade instant clear reward. Suddenly, outside an encirclement of thousands, 12,000 soul constructs appeared, each one of them with flickering red gold flames in their eyes. A demonic aura rose into the skies, a vicious momentum causing the dark clouds above to roll and rumble. It was only 12,000, not even 10% of the number here, but their pressure was even greater. At that moment, they all extended their hands and a spear appeared in each one of their palms. Some were long and wiry, some were scaled, others were short and stocky. All of them exuded a different sort of aura, but they were all without fail of the life grade. Lionel's body trembled just once as a blinding bronze aura rose from him. His halo descended and his body was coated in his second-tier armor. However, Rather than billowing with radiant blue fog, a violent torrent of red-gold flames billowed out from its vents. Everywhere he stepped, the ground crumbled to ash, large pits forming beneath him. Bang! The red-gold flames erupted from Lionel's back, forming a large pair of overbearing wings. "Don't move." Lionel's words were calm, but the air seemed to crackle and pop as he spoke them. It took a while for others to understand that he wasn't referring to his enemies at all. Instead, he was talking to his allies. His meaning was clear. If they moved, he couldn't guarantee that they wouldn't die too. Lionel suddenly flickered and vanished. A heat wave rippled across the battlefield as his wings of Scarlet Star Force trembled just a single time. This wall of heat crashed into the wall of enemies around him. The weak among them were immediately burnt to ashes. Rows of several hundred fell in droves, the residual heat alone being far too much for them to handle. However, what was even more shocking was that they weren't even Lionel's target to begin with. He appeared before Juan first, his palm stretching out for the latter's head. "Juan!" Droit roared, sending his rope dart forward with the greatest strength he could muster. The sound barrier boomed and the air whistled, a large accumulation of spiraling force appearing before Lionel's forehead. However, Droit's rope dart seemed to meet an impenetrable barrier an entire meter from Lionel. Then, under his astonished gaze, the rope dart trembled and then fell into a rain of ash. Droit's eyes widened. That rope dart, it was a top-of-the-line gold-grade treasure. How could it possibly just— Lionel's hand landed on Juan's forehead. Not once did he look in Droit's direction the entire time. It was as though he had already expected them to be able to put up no resistance at all. Bang! Juan's head exploded like a watermelon, but even the rain of blood and gore didn't last long before it was burnt to ash. Without the protection of Juan's force, his flesh had no ability to protect itself in Lionel's presence. "Juan!" Droit roared, his gaze turning bloodshot. "I'll kill you." The words had hardly left Droit's mouth when he registered that Lionel was already before him. The world felt eerily silent at that moment. All he could hear was a high-pitched whining. He looked down at his chest, only to find that an arm had already ripped through him and pulled his heart out, burning it to ash. Chapter 1990. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 1990. Shameless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Hewlett and Druid's eyes opened wide. While they were also geniuses of the Libra family and were stronger than Juan and Droit, this was only because the two of them were older. They fell into a middle generation similar to Valerie and the Gold Dark brothers, and as such had had more time to acclimate and grow within the seventh dimension. However, in terms of talent, they were both inferior to those two of the so-called Cataclysm generation. Seeing the two of them die like this, and so directly, their gazes couldn't help but turn crimson at all. Although nothing was set in stone, they had known for a long time that Juan and Droit would likely become their husbands despite the love they clearly had for Kiza. But now they had been made widows before they would accept such a reality. Their fury rose like a tsunami, but it seemed that they hadn't noticed that today, they already finished their role as the hunter. From this point forward, they were nothing but prey. Lionel appeared in the skies above Hewlett, his foot stomping down just once. Bang! The sole of Lionel's feet and Hewlett's back didn't even properly connect. A wave of heat and wall of wind seemed to fuse into one, descending down with the density of a mighty pillar as she was drilled into the ground. A strong aura of destruction caused Hewlett to spit up a mouthful of blood. Her skin of force quickly resisted, but she could feel it being peeled away inch by inch. If that destructive aura touched her, even without experiencing it personally, she knew that she would become nothing but a pile of ash just like Juan and Droit before her. "Hewlett!" Druid screeched. "What are you all doing? Kill them all." There were hundreds of thousands of them, and yet they were all frozen by one man. How could they be any more pathetic? Druid rushed forward, her steps becoming akin to a floral dance and her rope dart spinning around her body like the body of a voluminous dress. The army had been shaken by the flap of Lionel's wing. Ever since the first wave of destruction, they hadn't stopped. It felt like they weren't facing flames at all. They were facing the fiery abyss of hell, a place where you could only be chewed up, but there would be nothing at all left to spit out. Even so, they had no choice but to follow Druid's orders. They roared out, swarming toward Lionel, but at that moment, the soul constructs that had been completely immobile suddenly moved. The ground shook as they took a step and thrust out together. In that instant, with just a single attack, over 10,000 of them had fallen. Lionel struck out with his palm, meeting Druid's attack head-on. Bang! She crashed into the ground below as Lionel kicked downward once again, driving Hewlett even further into the ground. He didn't seem to have registered that she was a petite woman at all. His mind projected nothing but a meat bag. Druid surged into the air, a large amount of water force breathing life into the surroundings and seemingly trying to fight back against Lionel's Scarlet Star force. Lionel's head tilted in her direction. His eyes seemed to shine through the visor of his divine armor, the indifference of his expression palpable. "You're annoying." Emperor's edict, activated, and Druid's water force was snuffed out as though it was a weak flame. Lionel appeared before her, punching out just once. His fist didn't even connect with her skull, but it shattered into a rain of brain matter and bone. It was as though anything that entered a meter radius of Lionel was only destined for one path: death. Lionel landed on the ground, his heel driving into the back of Juan's head. The last sight she saw in her life was the endless darkness of Earth. Lionel took a step forward. His gait wasn't fast at all. Everywhere he passed, more and more warriors seemed to be roaring and rushing toward him. But without fail, every time they came close, they burst into a rain of ashes. However, he didn't spare them a single glance, his gaze entirely focused on Kiza. Kiza's chest heaved, but she barely managed to maintain a calm expression. If it wasn't for the bead of sweat falling down her brow under the heat, one would have thought that she was completely unruffled. She felt around for her badge, and only sighed a breath of relief when she felt it in her palm. Knowing that she could crush it at any time put her completely at ease. "What? Are you very angry?" Kiza sneered. "What good is your range? Will it change your mother? Her actions? Everyone knows the truth already. Plus, after today, everyone will know how shameless the Morales are. You just blatantly allowed him to break one of the rules of the Air Wars. Do you think this is victory? I've already crushed you. And once I leave this place and enter the real world where you can't twist and bend rules to your will, I'll crush you again." Kiza's sneer deepened. She seemed to want to wait until Lionel got closer. She wanted Lionel to try and approach her only to fail in the end. She wanted to see the despair on his face as she disappeared, and he could do nothing about it. At the same time, she wanted to humiliate the Morales family. How dare they cheat? This was the only explanation she had for Lionel seemingly breaking one of the rules by activating the upgrade challenge in their presence. However, Lionel's expression didn't change in the slightest. His speed remained the same, his slow walk forward feeling like footsteps grinding against her heart. Lionel closed the distance between the two. Not a single person could seem to stop him. By the time he could probably reach out and touch her, the remaining of the army had already turned to run, only to find themselves being mowed down one after another by Lionel's soul constructs. "Go on. Crush it," Lionel said lightly. Kiza suddenly trembled. Why did he sound like that? "Do it. Crush it." Lionel's voice suddenly came out in a roar, and Kiza reacted as though she had been commanded. Her palm subconsciously squeezed, the fear on her face clear. However, when her eyes opened, they couldn't help but widen. She was still in the same place. No. How can you be so shameless? She couldn't believe it. The Morales family were bold enough to flaunt their rules like this? So easily? Without the slightest care for the reaction of everyone else? Where was her mother? Why hadn't they stopped this farce yet? Why was she still here? "Save me." Lionel suddenly grabbed her hair and drove his knee into her face. Kiza entered a daze. She felt the world spinning. Her nose bones entered her face and her front row of teeth all shattered. However, she didn't even have the luxury of flying back, her hair still firmly in Lionel's grip. Chapter 1991. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 7 seconds AM. Chapter 1991. Reverse scale if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Mistress Gemin's expression froze. Her glass of wine suddenly cracking in her hands. Morales family. It wasn't just her. Many others looked toward the Morales family at once, looking for an explanation. The change was too sudden, and it felt like the only thing that could facilitate it would be chilling. However, the Morales family didn't seem to feel like explaining anything. This non-answer only caused the atmosphere to grow more and more heated. Release my daughter. You're all wrong. The voice seemed to cut through the atmosphere, and it was even more shocking when many realized who it was. Of all the people to be speaking up, it was actually the scorned Queen Beauty, and from what it seemed, she was actually defending the Morales family. That formation, for all intents and purposes, is the mind of Lionel Morales. It is separate from the constructed world of the Air Wars, as it is built on its own dream force. He can break as many rules as he wants within it so long as those rules don't fundamentally break the logic of the Air Wars world, and the action he is executing doesn't require feedback. The badge didn't work because he simply didn't want it to. It's that simple. For example, Lionel still needed to use the silver grade clear reward, and couldn't just use his formation to bypass it entirely. This was because he needed the Air Wars world to provide him with not only the soul constructs he was currently using, but also the rewards that would come with such an upgrade. However, he didn't need this sort of feedback with Kiza's badge. In fact, he wanted to cut off this feedback entirely so that the world couldn't register that she had died. So long as he wanted to complete a task that didn't need the Air Wars world, he could do it. Mistress Gemin's head snapped toward Cynthia's, a malevolent expression hardly hidden in the depths of her eyes. At that moment, it looked like she wanted to devour everything around her. She didn't even seem to register the fact that her wine had spilled all over her dress. What was this supposed to mean? Was she just supposed to watch her daughter die, then? Ancestor Hito opened his eyes, looking toward Cynthia with a deep gaze. He hadn't explained this point when he described Lionel's formation earlier, but it seemed that this woman had seen through it anyway. Indeed, she was quite a genius. He had an advantage that came from the world being created by his hand. He could sense the differences and the changes Lionel was causing. But Cynthia had no such references to rely on. She used nothing more than a small explanation from him, and she extrapolated the rest of the information on her own. Of course, she didn't do this out of the kindness of her heart. If the Air Wars ended here, it would be much more difficult to take Lionel's life. She ultimately didn't want a domain war either, so it was for the greater good if Lionel were to die within the Air Wars themselves. That way the Morales family wouldn't be able to say anything. If anything, this was only positive. The more the human domain saw of Lionel's viciousness, the easier it would be. Cynthia's gaze flashed with a hint of coldness. Bang, bang, bang. Lionel treated Kiza like a ragdoll, his actions savage and entirely unrestrained. If there was anything he held back in, it was the retreat of his Scarlet Star Force. He wouldn't allow this kind of woman to die so easily. Holding on to her hair, he smashed her head into the ground several times. It was only when he thought that he might accidentally shatter her skull did he pull back, lifting her high and grabbing one of her wrists. Kiza, whose head was spinning and was having a hard time seeing straight, didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. Her eyes suddenly opened wide and her mouth, missing several teeth, released a blood-curdling screech. Her arm was ripped out of its socket, a current of blood following the arc of Lionel's follow-through. A flicker of a flame pulsed in Lionel's eyes as her wound was seared close in stomach-churning fashion. The air was filled with the stench of burning meat and blood and carnage. Bang, bang, bang. Lionel was absolutely relentless. He seemed to have entirely forgotten that there was an entire army around him, but then again, not a single one of them even dared to get close to him. Many of them had a deep fear of Kiza in the depths of their heart. Seeing her being treated like this left them shivering uncontrollably. Lionel's gaze didn't even seem like that of a human anymore. It was as though no amount of beating could possibly allow Kiza to atone for her sins. Her face was entirely unrecognizable. Her clothing was in rags, but even what should have been the soft and supple skin beneath was entirely ruined. Mistress Gemin could see nothing but red, but she was only in the 7th dimension. Although she had strong control over the Gemin family, The ancestor wouldn't allow her to do as she pleased, especially when the Omen family had also already spoken. However, what Lionel did next made her faint directly. Her force went so far out of control that her skin burst, red streaks running down her rolled-back eyes, ears and nose. "You like talking about whores a lot, right?" Lionel's voice seemed to rise from an icy hell. Kiza shuddered. She wished for nothing more than to pass out, but Lionel had somehow managed to stop her from doing so. She could feel every break of the flesh, every shatter of her bones, every strong impact. She had never experienced such suffering in her entire life. Suddenly, she was tossed out, her body landing heavily in an encirclement of the beasts she had been so proud to be in control of just moments ago. The eyes of the human domain widened. They knew that from that moment onward, that fiendish gaze of Lionel's would be imprinted onto their nightmares. And at the same time, they knew never to touch his reverse scale. The echoes of Kiza's screams sent jolts of electricity down their spines. Chapter 1992. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 1992. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1992. Key to victory. Ancestor Alvaro cleared his throat as Ancestor Hito waved a hand, blocking the human domain from the option of seeing that scene. His temper seems to be a bit. Alvaro coughed lightly. He seemed to have no care for the fairer sex at all. The echoes of Kiza made even them as ancestors shudder. The ancestors of the Gamine family had expressions as dark as night. Kiza might not be directly related to most of them, but she was still the pride and joy of the family, only behind that of her mother. Plus, as most of their upper echelon were women, they were particularly sensitive to this brand of revenge that Lionel had chosen. And it seemed that Lionel had acted this way despite being more than smart enough to know this. They wanted nothing more than to rip Lionel limb from limb. But Lionel himself only seemed to be looking for more targets. He ripped through what remained of the Libra and Gamine armies, his momentum not dying down in the slightest. Compared to the Gold-Grade army, this was even easier. The Gold-Grade army didn't have the emotions and fears of humans, they only knew how to keep charging and aiming for the kill. However, this army had just seen their leaders systematically defeated one after another, their comrades slaughtered with nothing more than the flap of a pair of wings. How could they still have the will to fight? They were practically pieces of meat on a chopping board. Cynthia's deductions were indeed correct about the formation, but even though they were correct, they were too limited in scope because not many understood what it really meant for this formation to become an extension of Lionel's dream world. When Lionel usually deployed his starry spirit domain, his dream world was projected, but it only really became a part of the world, layering atop of it. With this formation, though, his dream world was the world. The laws, the rules of physics, the logic, it was all dictated by him as though he was lucid dreaming. In fact, that was the name of this self-created formation, the lucid dream formation. Lionel had only exposed a small portion of its abilities, one part due to him liking to keep trump cards in his back pocket, but another part was due to the sheer strain. At the moment, the formation was just a work in progress. He wouldn't be able to use it with true freedom until he entered the 8th dimension at least, but by then it would be so refined and perfected that it would become nigh untouchable. The entire Libra and Gamine family armies were wiped out. By this point, there didn't seem to be any other powers on the supercontinent that could even begin to threaten Lionel. However, Lionel's next step seemed quite odd. First, he placed the Silver City he had just formed down and let its walls take shape. After a while, he communicated with the tour currently run by the Cloud Race, and they took over all of the territory that had once been the Leo, Libra and Gamine families. Like this, the Dayside supercontinent was split between two supreme powers, but in reality, everyone watching on the outside was very much aware that Lionel, the sixth-dimensional existence who should have been among the first to fall, had conquered an entire continent for himself. While there were still some powers here and there, it was only a matter of time for them all to be wiped out, and for the continent to truly be unified. Roalfedialfes and Nuom at the same time. Despite the victory, Lionel knew when to take a step back as well. After his aggressive forward step, Rather than openly claiming the continent, he maintained the illusion of the continent being controlled by two strong powers. In addition, he used his Silvergrade city like a dummy capital city, while placing it within the same mountain range his original city had been in. It was difficult to tell exactly which of the two was the main city, especially when he ordered some soldiers of the Oryx and Skies to manage it. More importantly than that, he had monopolized the resources of an entire continent for himself. No matter how you looked at it, Lionel was by far and away firmly within first place. However, there wasn't a hint of satisfaction on Lionel's face. Just a pair of families like the Libra and Gamine had actually pushed him to this extent. By the time he started targeting the other continent, they would be even more established, with even more subordinates. The gap would only grow larger and larger. Lionel's expression was dark. He only seemed to react when a soft hand slipped into his. Aina smiled. She's already suffered the worst kind of humiliation and death. There's no need to keep being mad, because then she wins, right? Lionel blinked. Indeed, he wasn't mad about the odds he was being faced with, he was just still pissed off about Kiza. Maybe the fact that she had almost forced him into a corner made him a bit more sensitive about another potentially doing the same. But the root was ultimately her. He had every confidence that he would be able to crush everything in his path. He should just forget about such trash. Lionel smiled and nodded, the heavy atmosphere suddenly vanishing with the wind. Let's return. We have work to do after resting. Lionel and the others entered the nearest outpost and teleported back to the Goldgrade base. Lionel's mind flickered with many thoughts. His formation was powerful, but its greatest weakness was its lack of mobility. Even setting it up took over half a day. It just wasn't feasible to use continuously. He would have to put his eggs in a different sort of basket. Soon, the Umbra family would return with the details of the supercontinent, and he would redeploy the cloud race that had been freed up after the territories he had sent them into were destroyed. They had made a lot of things smoother for him, and as the numbers of subordinates on the other side grew, it would be even easier for them to infiltrate and relay information back to him. For now, though, he would rest. When he awoke, he would begin to take his first steps into the ocean. The key to victory was within. Chapter 1993. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 5:41 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1993. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1993. His littlest Nova seems to be leaving us without much of a choice, Ancestor Alvaro said lightly. With things being like this, it was clear that there was no option remaining for the Morales. They had already known ahead of time, but there was simply no dodging things this time. Even the most pacifist among them could see it as bright as day. War was looming over the horizon. That child of the Omen family seemed to still be trying to avoid war, but the method by which she wanted to do so was by killing littlest Nova. She could only be said to be naive if she believed that this would stop things. They knew Velasco well enough to know that he wouldn't care if Lionel died to those of his generation. Even if they had a 20-year advantage, he was just that kind of madman. But they also knew Velasco well enough to know that if his wife was enraged, then he was enraged. If his wife pointed, he would do it. If his wife wanted someone dead, they would die. In truth, Velasco was even more of a madman than they knew. To him, his seed should be capable of facing off against the entire human domain without trouble. Now that Lionel had seventh-dimensional strength, he had grown up enough to maneuver the world on his own. Of course, all of this was irrelevant so long as Alienor shed a single tear. Even if the Morales did nothing, the Omen would face the wrath of Velasco. People knew too little about Alienor and the Ascension Empire. If not, they would know that facing the wrath of these two entities was definitely something to take note of as well. Alpha D Alpha Theta Theta Nu Epsilon, he's decisive, more decisive than the rest of us. The moment the human domain showed such intentions, we should have already known that war was inevitable. He's already treating it as such. At this point, he's only slaughtering their futures right before them and staking his claim to this generation. The Morales family looked around them, and it seemed as though half of those present were seeing red. Most would have already left by now if not for the fact they wanted to wait to see Lionel fall. They were like gambling addicts. gritting their teeth and waiting for the chips to fall correctly. Of course, there were some with far more sinister intentions than just that. If it wasn't sowing discord, they were definitely lying in wait. If by some miracle Lionel really managed to make it out, escaping the clutches of the countless geniuses of his generation, they would be here. They really wanted to see if the Morales family truly dared to face off against the entire human domain alone. When Lionel returned to his city, after delegating some tasks, he nearly collapsed. He entered the pod for an entire 2 hours, the worth of over a week. His gaze couldn't help but sharpen. He had thought he felt fine, but this amount of rest period painted a completely different picture. The reality was that there was something he had done that was hidden from Cynthia Omen, and that was using his formation to more freely control his Scarlet Star Force. He only remembered feeling a fiery, burning rage that was threatening to boil over at every moment. Roalfadialfes, a new man now, seeing how long it had taken his body to recover despite him feeling fine. Lionel realized something else. It seems that it's already affecting my mental state. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Wise Star Order had already warned him that there would be a price to pay for the oversized growth of his Scarlet Star Force innate node, but he thought he had made great progress already. If he was measuring things by what Wise Star Order had said, he essentially needed to reach the state of being able to freely use his Scarlet Star Force within a third-dimensional world, to be free of any potential ill effects. He was already making good progress toward that. He had around 100 years to succeed, and it had only been around a year or two since he had this conversation with Wise Star Order. So he should still have plenty of time left. The good news was that the effects were still subtle, but it was important that he realized this now. Just because he had a lot of time left, didn't mean that his Scarlet Star Force had no ability to affect him now. In fact, if he had let it rampage around for any longer, he would have suffered pretty greatly. If his body hit empty but he kept trying to push it, the result would be disastrous. There was another mother that was exceptionally important here. Within his formation, the fatigue aspects of the Air Wars world couldn't affect him so long as he kept it activated. And yet he was still so tired. This painted a picture that couldn't be more obvious. That formation truly took a lot out of him. Lionel adjusted himself, and his gaze grew firm. With a step he vanished from his pod, and appeared on the tall city walls of his territory. Down below, the ocean pounded against the walls. The others should have woken up long before him, and started executing his orders. The surrounding 20 kilometers were all within their purview. There were almost too many things to clear in this region. However, not only did Lionel have that 20 kilometers, but he had also spent all 30 billion of his points to extend it by an additional 300 kilometers using his underwater outposts. The best part was that these underwater outposts that he had bought at a cost of 10 million points each, also had the teleportation function. I've rested enough. It seems that it's about time to begin. Lionel flickered and vanished. The supercontinent was conquered. There was only a final push to be made. Once he had finished accumulating, it would be time to march toward the dark side continent. But for now, these gold and air grade challenges and dungeons were his. Chapter 1994. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 1:07 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 1994. Show me if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The current situation wasn't bad. It could even be said to be quite excellent. Due to Keys's actions, Lionel had gained himself around 200,000 beasts. The beasts didn't have great combat prowess, but they did have great speed, and their strength was at least enough to match up to bronze-grade threats. Those that had crossed the Tier 4 barrier could match up against those of the 7th dimension. Fadem in reality, these beasts were quite pitiful. The gap between the tiers of the 7th dimension should be enormous. The gap between Tier 9 of the 6th dimension and Tier 1 of the 7th was only a precursor to what one might find on the other side. Someone like Lionel and Aina who could battle across that barrier could only be said to be monsters. As many of their number was already in Tier 6, they should have been the strongest creatures of the Air Wars, and yet they were already now on their third owner without any ability to resist. This was also the reason why, though Lionel took this gain as a positive, it was only a slight one. He didn't expect these beasts to cause a game-changing event unless he used them with exceptional cleverness, though he wasn't unique to such things. Ironically, Lionel's strongest fighters were probably those of the Cloud race, specifically May. If he fought her while holding back, the odds of him winning were next to zero. She was a tier of strength beyond even James. However, he had oddly chosen to sideline her into an odd position. The rest of the Cloud race in general were exceptional. Even the weakest of a gold-grade threat, while most were beyond and could face an air-grade threat on their own. It was almost a shame that Lionel only had control over a few thousand of them. Lionel organized these thoughts as he moved through the water with great speed. Soon he had reached the region of the first air-grade threat. In truth, Lionel didn't have to go through all of this trouble. He had already thought of the golden-scaled koi fish in his possession. So long as he released that annoying little guy, a storm of force would form quite quickly that would catch the attention of all the oceanic beasts. This was the very same tactic it had used when it caused that oceanic beast flood all those years ago. It would benefit Lionel quite greatly to use it to his advantage now, or so it seemed. But there were many issues with this approach, the first of which being the fact that there wasn't enough control. That insane method only worked when your goal was to destroy everything. Lionel didn't want to do such a thing. The effort for the reward wasn't worth it. It had to be remembered that for the air-grade upgrade challenge, there would be 10 million gold-grade threats matched with 100 air-grade generals. There were already quite a number of air-grade threats just in this region alone. If Lionel really used the koi fish, he would end up facing a threat even worse than the air-grade upgrade challenge. At that point, he would be digging his own grave. There was, of course, another problem as well, and that was alerting his enemies to what he was doing. The commotion of such a method wouldn't be small in the slightest, so this was his best choice. That said, Lionel wasn't here to gather a measly 100,000 points. Rather, while everyone else was focused on clearing the challenges and the dungeons, he was focused on clearing these air-grade ocean monsters. As for why, the answer to that was obvious. He wanted their soul constructs. At the same time, this location was a convenient time to test the changes in his Void Star Force. Lionel extended a hand and grasped at the water, bringing out his black rod. At the same time, his first-tier divine armor covered his body as 5 stars appeared to his back. Vital Star Force flooded the peaks and crevices of his armor, lighting up the dark depths of the ocean. In the distance, an enormous shark beast finally noticed Lionel's appearance. Its menacing teeth bared, and it swept its tail out just once. This simple action shot it forward like an iron ball from a cannon, the water gliding against its slipper skin as it grew to double its size in Lionel's eyes in an instant. Lionel's pupils constricted. Fast. He hadn't expected the jump to air grade would be so enormous. He had experienced the jumps from subgrade to bronze grade up to gold grade, and he had thought he had a solid understanding by now, but just this movement alone let him know that he was very wrong. Lionel blocked the charge of the shark, feeling his organs jar as he was sent flying backward. His gaze narrowed. It was harder to produce force underwater, but after you had succeeded, the impact of that force was much greater. Flying through the air was one matter, but being sent flying through water, especially at great speed, felt like he was being hit with a freight train again and again. All right, fair enough. Lionel balanced himself as the shark beast charged again. He took a deep breath. Even underwater, he wasn't impeded at all. At his level, he didn't see objects like he had back in the third dimension, especially not after comprehending a bit of force manipulation. Items weren't just themselves, they were also the sum of the forces that summed them up. Separating out the water force and only absorbing the wind force that carried the oxygen he wanted was all too easy for the current Lionel. Lionel wasn't enraged that this shark beast was powerful at all. In fact, he was happy. The more powerful it was, the more worthwhile this would be. He even hoped they would get stronger. Rather than switching to his second-tier armor or activating star fusion, Lionel's body relaxed and he brandished his spear as the shark appeared before him again. This would be the only remaining time he had to do this before he was embroiled in battle after battle again. He wanted to see how much more room he had to improve his Void Star Force. The 2 dark blue stars to his back glowed, the ocean waters suddenly trembling. Show me what you can do. Chapter 1995. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 1:07 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 1995. Not enough if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's battle intent blazed. With a step, a vortex of water formed to the sole of his feet. The water in the surroundings grew much heavier, and the blazing light around him dimmed. The charging shark beast immediately found that its forward momentum was stifled greatly. Although it still appeared before Lionel with great speed, this time, Lionel had more than enough time to react. He swung down with a savage intention, his divine armor trembling with life. Bang! The shark beast was sent spiraling downward, but Lionel's gaze narrowed. Its skin was a great combination of silky and slippery matched with tough and rubbery. Getting a good slice on it was difficult, but even when you managed to, its skin and the underlying flesh and fat was so elastic and injury-proof. Lionel took another step and surged down toward the shark beast. He felt the changes in the water around him. As the pressure increased, he seemed to get closer and closer to the feeling that Void Star Force gave him. What Lionel was looking for was an enlightenment similar to what he had gained from Earth Force. His comprehension of it had been entirely flipped on its head when he realized that Earth Force was just as much related to Life Force as any of the other elements. Bang! 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 Fatum Lionel's gaze narrowed as he clashed with the shark beast again and again. Although he was still holding back, the strength of this shark beast was still far outside of his expectations. He didn't even have half a dozen people who could face off against these creatures alone. Dealing with 100 would definitely come with great difficulty. It was no wonder the upgrade challenge didn't require facing off against millions of them. If that was the task, there probably wouldn't be anyone who could accomplish such a thing among the heirs. Even if they all decided to work together, it would be fruitless. Lionel punched out once, meeting the jagged edge of one of the sharp beast's large teeth. Crack! That's it. That's the feeling right there. Lionel had chosen to change his approach after several exchanges. His water force affinity simply wasn't high enough to try and grasp the secrets of Void Star Force, just by relying on the water around him alone. But it was a different question if he tried to map on his feelings toward Scarlet Star Force, toward the force that should be its most direct opposite. When he used Scarlet Star Force now, he could feel the presence of a barrier that extended from his body, a domain that sought to destroy everything in his path with a single touch. It repelled and shredded apart all. He looked for a similar feeling within the runes of his Void Star Force and he found it. Rather than repelling and shredding apart, it gathered and fused. Once destroyed on contact, and the other almost seemed to create more of a thing, but it wasn't exactly that. Rather than creating, it was making it more substantial, more tangible, much heavier. Lionel's fist became like a vortex, swallowing everything in its path. The result was a fist that was twice as heavy-handed. Even without adding any more strength to his blow, it became twice as powerful, shattering the tooth of the shark beast and making it cry out in pain. Sound waves traveled with much more vigor in water. The echo almost shattered Lionel's eardrums, but he still followed up again, and then again. With every strike, his fist became heavier and heavier, until he suddenly swung out with his spear. With a single thrust, a spiraling pattern of blood and torn flesh ripped through the shark beast's tough skin. Lionel dodged out of the way of a tail swipe, fighting against the startling current that formed to pierce out again and again. Every time he did so, his comprehension seemed to deepen and the violent black hole of his power became more and more profound. Void Star Force should have had the greatest defensive power, but its offensive power was truly startling. Suddenly, Lionel raised a hand and clenched his fist. The shark beast that had chosen to suddenly turn in an attempt to run found the waters around it as viscous as cold lard. It swayed its tail with as much strength as it could muster. But even that action seemed to have slowed considerably. Lionel appeared above its head, the intent in his eyes blazing as a deep blue vortex danced within the depths of his irises. It looked as though his gaze alone could swallow up the world as he pierced downward. The blade of his spear extended, and a rotating vortex of black-blue took shape. The head of the shark beast caused Lionel's attack to pause for just 2 seconds before he finally ripped through, shredding into its bone and eventually its brain. The shark beast unleashed one final howl before it collapsed, unable to sustain its life any longer. Lionel's point total raised by 100,000 points as he waved a hand, storing the corpse of the shark beast. He took a breath and exhaled. He didn't feel too good about that battle. Void Star Force was a force on par with Scarlet Star Force, but it didn't feel that way in his hands. Even with such effort, it still took 2 seconds to break through the shark beast's head. That amount of time was an eternity at his level. If there were any other variables, he would have failed. I need to keep honing it. The ocean holds too much importance for me to not be able to bring out incredible strength within its limits. This isn't enough. This was the secondary benefit of him sending everyone out now. They had no choice but to gain experience fighting in the depths of the ocean. It was the only way for him to make sure that they would be ready for anything. Lionel shot forward, aiming for his second air-grade beast. Chapter 1996. Published at 11th of July, 2023, 1:07 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 1996. Third and fourth. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again, as Lionel's actions seem to garner a ton of attention due to the appearance of yet another rare force. The situation on the Nightside continent was suffering its own sort of trial by fire. While Lionel had succeeded in unifying his continent, this was far from the case for the Nightside. This was only to be expected. Not only were there large movements from First Nova, Third Nova, Fourth Nova and Sixth Nova, this continent also had the Omen family, the spiritual's faith and half of the constellation families. While Lionel's continent was whole, the Nightside continent was divided into at least a dozen large-scale territories that covered hundreds of kilometers in radius. The fight over resources was great, and many had begun to realize that having access to the ocean's waters was of huge importance. Even so, if there was one that had eked out a first-place position in the hearts of those watching, it actually seemed to be Third Nova, Zavnik. In the beginning, Zavnik had used a huge loophole to his advantage. Each family had only been allowed to send in a maximum of 2 heirs, but there was no such limitation across families or alliances. This had helped the Constellation Bow Alliance form a huge coalition quite quickly before they were destroyed by Lionel, and it had likewise helped Zavnik. Rather than having his people enter as his kill exchanges, he made a bet on himself and had them enter alone. Many realized that Zavnik may very well have had even more subordinates than it seemed. It was just that many of them had ended up on Lionel's continent instead of his own. But regardless, he had caused so many heirs to defect to his side that he had started off with a hot streak that he had yet to allow anyone to close. Despite the volatility of the Nightside continent, Zavnik alone had taken out 2 constellation families, the Cornus and Cancer families. From the Cancer family, he gained a large waterfront territory, securing a large coastal control as had become the meta of the Nightside continent. Much like the Pisk and Aquarius families, the Cancer family had come with the intention of targeting the ocean. However, the Cancer family was a bit of an anomaly. For lack of a better descriptor, the Cancer family were parasites. The type of water force they controlled was one they called Cancer Force. This force was a fusion of life force, water force and soul force, and it had applications as odd as this fusion of forces. The Cancer family was able to use water force as a carrier of their force. Once their Cancer force was deployed, so long as the target had any water force in them, they would be cursed. This was a fate that humans couldn't dodge, as far too much of their bodies were formed of this force. Depending on the path the Cancer family had taken, they could do quite a number of things with this control. Some controlled humans, others controlled beasts, some were excellent at reconnaissance, but all were quite well known as Cancers. The original plan of the Cancer family was to poison the ocean's waters with their Cancer force and forcefully take hold of the creatures within its limits. The trouble with this plan is that it would take quite a long time. It was relatively easier since corrupting water force was what they did first, but the ocean was obviously impressively large. The other problem with this plan is that it was quite useless to control oceanic beasts if they couldn't change the situation on land. The Cancer family hadn't been able to find an underwater territory in time, so they had to settle for one on land for the time being, but that made them a target for Zavnik to crush. In addition to this, Zavnik took control of the oceanic beasts that the Cancer family had managed to gather for himself. using them as the spearheads for his scouting. The Cornus family was the only high-level family of the human domain known purely for their hand-to-hand combat. However, they were also the fourth and final family with strong ties to water force. In fact, the style of their close combat was entirely built on concepts of the tides and waves. One might realize at this point that this was most definitely not a coincidence. For two of the families Zavnik had targeted to have such ties, it was clear that this was likely his plan from the beginning. He knew that he didn't have affinity with water force, and as such relied on others who did to build the foundation. He would need to take advantage of it. While he gained oceanic beasts from the Cancer family, what he gained from the Cornus family was arguably even more valuable. They had a treasure designed to read and record the waves, almost like radar but with water force instead. They used their comprehension of tides and waves to form this sort of scouting device. Like this, Zavnik had gained not just one, but two methods of exploring the ocean's waters. He knew well that First Nova's partner was the princess of the Aquarius family. If he wanted to make sure he didn't lose his advantage, he had to push quite fiercely. Though he thought this didn't stop him from marching on the night side continent. As for his target, it was none other than Fourth Nova Seo. Fourth Nova was none other than the very same Nova who had tried to sign Aina to a contract. He seemed to have changed greatly since then, having vanished into thin air. Since then Lionel hadn't seen or heard a peep out of him. But now it seemed that there would be a clash between two brothers once again. Zavnik looked forward with a confident expression, while Seo looked down from the city walls quite solemnly. Zavnik's army had already grown to almost 1 million. It was likely that after this campaign, he would directly challenge the gold grade upgrade trial. After a moment, though, Fourth Nova's expression sharpened, the hum of a spear echoing from him. Chapter 1997. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 18 seconds AM. Chapter 1997. Long time. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again as Third and Fourth Nova faced off against one another. First Nova had made great progress as well. As expected, he made great use of having Vega by his side. The Aquarius family had high affinity in both the wind and water. Their understanding and comprehension of both is exceptionally profound, and thanks to this, their seafaring vessels are without a doubt the best in the whole of the human domain. Adderworth's trust in Vega was no less than Lionel's trust in Aina. As such, after reaching a certain point, the two separated themselves between two territories, one underwater and the other on land. Their efficiency was quite great and their progress was excellent. These two, First and Third Nova, were without a doubt the two with the strongest presence in the water on the night side supercontinent. The others could only be said to be much further behind, but this didn't mean that they didn't have their own advantages. Sixth Nova had focused entirely on his military might. Much like Lionel, he claimed a territory as quickly as possible, carving out a place for himself. Although his territory wasn't the largest as that right was left to Zavnik, it was the second largest. However, he had run into problems of his own as well, much like Fourth Nova. He found himself sandwiched between both the Omen and spiritual faith. Much like Vega and Adderworth had separated, his partner, Bruno, had no choice but to take the helm in sweeping toward the west while he moved toward the east. After several clashes, the Omen and spiritual faith seemed to realize that Sixth Nova wouldn't be easily dealt with, and as such they turned their attention away. Even so, most seemed to believe that Valor's days were numbered. The spiritual faith didn't seem to be taking part in these air wars for the sake of victory. Rather, they had only sent in a few dozen individuals, all of whom had spiritual blood running through their veins. Their only goal seemed to be to display their strength and spread awe for the spiritual race. The Omen family didn't have great combat strength just yet, as many of those they had exchanged for were pure crafters. However, with such a large team of crafters working as one, there was no doubt that the longer the Omen family was allowed to survive, the larger their future advantage would be. Due to these reasons, many waved off Sixth Nova's ability to survive. While the spiritual faith had decided to focus elsewhere, it was only a matter of time before they felt it was about time to take him down. At the same time, once the Omen family settled and began rolling out their crafts with great momentum, Who would be able to stop him? Valor's only chance seemed to be to deal with them as quickly as possible, but it was clear to all that he didn't have the ability to do this. The Omen family was led by a young man. He was exceptionally tall, almost 7 feet in fact, but his frame was quite slight, the shoulders of his lab coat seeming to be quite loose on him. This young man was Crone. Had Lionel bothered to enter the Force Crafting Guild of the Void Palace, he would have recognized this young man. Because Ramon was so low-key, it was widely accepted that the best crafter of the younger generation was none other than Crone Omen, the younger cousin of Cynthia Omen, the scorned Queen Beauty. That said, even if Ramon was less of an introvert, the winner between the two of them wouldn't be clear. As talented as Ramon was, he split quite a bit of his time for his spear domain lineage factor. And even beyond that, most of his crafting research was focused on forging his divine armor. This focus had allowed him to form an exceptionally powerful gauntlet of divine armors. But these were obviously niche crafts that only he alone could use. Crone, however, was much more of a pure crafter. His skill was more wide-ranging and his toolkit was much deeper. That said, Crone wasn't alone in this. The brain power of the entire Omen family was at his back. The Omen family had entered with a systematic plan. Even their battle with Sixth Nova was nothing more than a pretext for keeping up appearances. There was a perfect blueprint they would follow from start to finish. A blueprint that had been worked on by the scorned Queen Beauty herself. This was the expertise of not a gold-grade crafter, but a tried-and-true life-grade crafter, and not just a normal life grade, but the true life grade of the 8th dimension. All of the plans from start to finish had been drawn up by her. Crone could be considered to be of a middle generation as well, too old to be among the Cataclysm generation, and too young to be a part of the Nebula generation of the Morales. Outside of crafting circles, his name was still capable of resonating, but it wasn't to the same extent of Cynthia and Velasco of the past. However, what he could do was execute orders, and thanks to his ability index, he was the perfect choice for this job. Crone stood in silence, monitoring the progress of the army of crafters. Very soon, everything would be ready. At this pace, they only needed 3 more days. After that, there wouldn't be anyone that could stop them. Lionel took deep breaths and exhaled, the momentum of both causing the waters around him to tremble. After a moment, he pulled up a giant squid beast's corpse and stowed it away. He had been hunting air-grade threats all day, and he had managed to capture just above 30. This was already a good number, and he felt that he was running on fumes now, so it was about time he returned. He found the nearest underwater outpost and flashed back to his city's core. But the moment he appeared, his pupils constricted. There was someone here. Lionel's head whipped around, but he couldn't spot them with his eyes immediately. Ignoring his fatigue, he deployed his starry spirit domain, enveloping the region with his dream world. When he saw who the two were, he immediately understood. Those crack city cores, they weren't from failed upgrades at all, were they? They were you too. Out from the shadows, 2 figures appeared. One was very obviously Second Nova. It turned out that Lionel was right to believe that 5 Novas wouldn't be placed on a single continent. There was indeed a third here. The second figure should be his partner, wrapped in mystery. However, the fogginess couldn't block Lionel's dream world. Long time no see, Kira. Chapter 1998. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 16 seconds AM. Chapter 1998. Kira Salvatine. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Kira was someone that Lionel had met long ago. She was actually the reason Little Blackstar had such great strength now. She was a bit quirky and silly, and Lionel found her to be actually quite adorable, but these could be considered to be less than ideal circumstances to meet, though Lionel had already guessed that something like this would happen. Back when the two of them had met in the Dimensional Cleanse trial zone, she had already told him that she couldn't become one of his generals because she was already tied to one of his cousins. Obviously, that cousin turned out to be Second Nova. Lionel had been wondering about this for quite a while though. The Salvatine family that Kira came from should have exceptional power. After all, how could a normal family possibly gain the blood of a void beast? It had to be remembered that void beasts were the most powerful and devastating creatures of the universe. The spirituals were commonly known as the most powerful race, but that was only because void beasts were so few in number. It was hard to rank them among such powerhouses because many believed that they had long since been extinct. For the Salvatine family to not only have such a large vial of their blood, but to even treat that blood like a gift to give a little girl, who was only in the fifth dimension at the time. Just how great did their power need to be? But oddly enough, Lionel simply never heard a peep about the Salvatine family after entering the wider world of the human domain. He didn't hear of any of them in the Void Palace. They weren't on any leaderboards. They didn't even appear for the gathering of powers that decided the rules of these air wars either. They seemed to have never existed at all, almost as though Kira had simply made up her name, and that her family never existed to begin with. This much was still acceptable. After all, the human domain was large, and the Lionel of back then was quite weak. Who knew, maybe the Salvatine family wasn't nearly as strong as he had thought them to be, and had just happened to run into the treasure of a void beast's corpse. In that case, Kira would likely have just been insane to casually give something like that out. But she was a bit of an airhead to begin with, so that was relatively easy for Lionel to accept. However, the problem with that line of thinking was that Lionel had been to the Void Library. Not only had he been to that library, he had read everything within it. And yet, that library didn't have a single mention of the Salvatine family. Not a small historical footnote, no family register, not a single mention or peep about them. Lionel didn't understand why this was before, but he suddenly understood now. When he looked at the shadowy figure that was Kira, it felt all so obvious. Kira wasn't human at all. She wasn't a beast, nor was she a spiritual. She was actually a demon. The shadow seemed to tremble slightly and then pout when Lionel called her out, but she still didn't step out, nor did Lionel expect her to. She had already made her allegiances clear, and Lionel didn't blame her for it. What was she supposed to do? Betray Orin despite the fact she had known him for her entire life while she had only met him for a brief instance? That didn't even make sense. Kira's shadowy figure trembled once more, and a pair of short sabers emitting dense black fog took form in her palms. At the same time, Orin moved slightly and a similar pair of short sabers appeared in his own. He didn't respond to Lionel's words, and if he was surprised by the fact that Lionel knew Kira, he didn't show it. However, his silence was more than proof enough to the likes of Lionel. Many had taken all sorts of differing approaches to the air wars. Some targeted the ocean, some prepared beasts ahead of time, others plotted and schemed as they built up large factories of crafting treasures. But there was one very important thing that all of these people missed. What good was all this preparation if your heir died? The moment an heir died, it was all over. The run of that power and the territory behind it would be finished. It was that plain and simple. During his tirade through the Dayside supercontinent, Lionel had run across many abandoned territories with cracked city cores. In fact, he had benefited from quite a few of them himself. He had originally thought that these territories had simply failed their upgrades as it was the most logical conclusion at the time, but seeing this now, it changed everything. Clearly, Orin had a method of sneaking into a territory undetected. If Lionel was correct, he was probably testing out this method on weaker powers before he targeted the ones he really wanted to get rid of. But he had likely never expected for Lionel to clear the supercontinent and claim it for himself so quickly. Even so, Orin had now perfected his method, and as far as he was concerned, Lionel had only made his job easier. Now he would be able to head to the other continent and claim victory in these air wars long before anyone could mount resistance. Now his target was to deal with Lionel. Seeing the two prepared for battle, Lionel took a deep breath. He had already sent everyone out on missions, and though they returned to rest whenever they were fatigued, it wouldn't be all together. Plus, how useful would they be if they returned as fatigued as he currently was? Wind surged toward Lionel from all sides, his lungs expanding as his heart pumping. Suddenly, the two figures of Orin and Kira vanished. Chapter 1999. Published at 19th of July, 2023. 8:54 and 13 seconds AM. Chapter 1999. That force. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's expression became one of unprecedented seriousness. He couldn't seem to track the two without deploying his starry spirit domain. Even his bow domain eyes didn't work. But in this state, deploying his starry spirit domain was quite the difficult task. At the same time, he knew how powerful Kira was. Even back then, suppressed by the dimensional cleanse world, she had given him an exceptionally tough battle. And that was without having access to her ability index or lineage factor on top of that. Orin's strength needed even less introduction. He was an heir of the Morales family, and unlike Ramon, he seemed to be proficient in a weapon other than the spear, making his spear domain lineage factor quite useless in the grand scheme outside of course, the power it could give him. This wasn't the only troublesome matter either. There was a very obvious and important question that he was ignoring in all of this. How was it that Orin was related to a demon family? There were only really two explanations, one of which was decidedly worse than the other. And that was of course that Orin had demon blood running through his body. This wasn't just a small, hand-waved issue. Lionel had already learned from the current patriarch of the Morales family that many of their ancestors and the other talented among them had trouble controlling their tempers, and that was related to the demonic characteristics of the metal synergy lineage factor. Logically speaking, this was a flaw, and any sort of flaw in a lineage factor made it weaker than it should have been. If Orin was half demon, it was likely that this flaw in his body was almost negligible, making the amount of strength that he could pull from his lineage factor far more than what one would see from most other Morales family members. Of course, no matter what advantage he had in this regard, it was impossible for him to match up to Lionel, who had brought the metal synergy lineage factor the 8th dimension far ahead of time. But it still had to be considered that Lionel was still in the 6th dimension while Orin was already in the 7th. As the second eldest Morales, the second Nova, Orin was already in Tier 3 of the 7th dimension. Until now, Lionel hadn't cared much about tiers because his talent so heavily suppressed everyone else. But if he was correct about Orin, then the advantage he had was far smaller. And that didn't even begin to mention Kira, who was likely a full demon at Tier 1 of the 7th dimension. Lionel had met the geniuses of other races in the tribulation zone of his spear domain ring. Although he had defeated them, he didn't underestimate them for even a second. That was because during the tribulation, much of the abilities they should have had were depressed, and they were mostly forced into a confrontation of spears. Kira could be considered to be the first full-fledged genius of another race that he would meet. Lionel's expression couldn't help but hold hints of solemnity. Finding a path to victory in this battle would be exceptionally difficult. Suddenly, Lionel's pupils constricted as he took a strong step back. A saber blade just barely nicked his chin, drawing a hot line of smoldering, crimson blood. Lionel didn't hesitate, immediately erupted into his second-tier divine armor, and released all 10 of his stars. He crossed his spear body before his body, just barely stopping another 2 sabers from piercing through his body. Lionel pivoted, blocked to his back, and took another step back. His head weaved to the side and his spear shifted, thrusting out but hitting nothing but air. The teamwork between Kira and Orin was immaculate. They seemed to still be probing him, but the pressure was immense. With the support of his 5th-dimensional divine armor, his strength wasn't small by any extent. This was only further bolstered by universal force. However, it was difficult to use strength if you couldn't apply it anywhere. Their speed was fast, their attacks were unpredictable, and their strength was great. The worst part was that they had yet to use their full abilities while Lionel was already putting in quite some effort. Lionel wasn't the only one unhappy about these turn of events. No one believed that Lionel would die to a fellow Morales, so if he fell here, that meant that they would lose their chance to kill him within the Air Wars. In an irony of ironies, Lionel and his enemies were actually currently on the same side. I can't let it continue like this, Lionel thought. To his astonishment, though Kira and Orin seemed to have read his intentions instantly, their attacks suddenly became more ferocious, their speed increasing. Both of them seemed to exude a corrosive sort of aura that tangled with his vital star force and swallowed it up. Lionel could vaguely recall this aura, only because when he had fought Kira previously, it was greatly suppressed. Now that he was feeling the full brunt of it, there was no doubt in his mind. This was Death Force. This wasn't the first time Lionel had come across this force, but for some reason it felt so much sharper and more savage now. His dream world couldn't seem to keep up with their vague forms, and it was at that moment that he realized that it was because the very fog that coated their bodies was corroding his dream force. How could he track them if his starry spirit domain was collapsing in on itself? Lionel shifted to the side, just barely moving out of the way of a saber, but at that moment one pierced into his shoulder blade, sliding through a sliver in his armor that wasn't even perceptible to the naked eye. Pain shot through his body and he felt as though an entire side of him had gone limp. The corrosion was devastating and more potent than any poison. Lionel's gaze flashed and his Scarlet Star Force circulated through his body, incinerating the Death Force to ash. His mouth opened and he unleashed a roar, his absolute spear domain roaring to life and shredding everything in his immediate surroundings to pieces. Chapter 2000. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 2000. Fair? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel took a breath and his gaze became frighteningly cold. At that moment, it was as though he had become a completely different person. His steps became calculated and measured, his spear strikes no longer feeling as wild and passionate. A cold breeze passed by as he stomped on the ground hard, his city lord manner trembling. His starry spirit domain vanished as he dismissed it. In its place, his starry star domain and starry light domain manifested at once. He took another step back. A saber came to a stop just before his forehead before it retracted. He took a step to the side. A saber whizzed by his ear just as he brandished his own blade. Clang. A shadowy figure took a step back and solidified for a moment before vanishing once more. However, Lionel still struck forward anyway, meeting resistance instantly. Clang. Lionel weaved in and out of the two of them. He never moved more than he had to, his energy reserves being perfectly preserved. In fact, it even felt that he was somewhat recovering. As time passed, Lionel entered less and less of a passive state. His spear force flourished, his universal force uplifting his body as he struck with stronger and stronger momentum. The abyss of his eyes could only be described as frigid. He didn't see people, he saw objects. He didn't see spear strikes, he saw angles. He didn't see defeat, he only saw a path to victory. As though a practiced chess master, his every step forward seemed to drive his enemies further and further into a corner. 93%. Lionel's right foot swept back in a semicircular arc, gliding along the floor as his hips swerved. A saber whistled by his neck. The distance was too close to use his spear, but that didn't stop him from using his fist. His spear vanished in a blink and his hip snapped back like an elastic band, his punching rocketing forward with it. Lionel finally connected with something solid, his second-tier armor billowing with violet steam as his star fusion. King's might roared. Bang! A shadowy figure was sent flying, piercing through the air. However, just before they crashed into the walls of the city manor, they vanished. Lionel was unmoved by the change. He had already moved again, his void star force rippling as he swung his spear out in a wide arm. Everywhere it passed, strong ripples passed through the air, almost like watching a bullet compress the wind in slow motion. Yet another figure was sent flying, a mouthful of blood flying through the air. Lionel was certain that this one was Kira, and the first had been Orin. They were actually so difficult to tell apart for him even now. Even so, Kira too vanished before crashing into anything. Lionel exhaled a breath, his frigid gaze becoming even colder. A piercing headache was threatening to split his mind in two currently, but he couldn't seem to feel it at all, having activated dream sense. He held his spear out, his heels slowly pivoting. Kira and Orin didn't appear for a long while. He narrowed his eyes, breathing slowly. But even after several minutes had passed by, they didn't appear again. They've left. Lionel made a show of relaxing slightly, but his heart was secretly on guard. For a pair of assassins like them, he wouldn't casually lower his guard. Although he had gained the upper hand while relying on his ability index, his mind felt like it was going to explode. Simulating the two of them and their actions felt like the most difficult thing he had ever done. And he was certain they hadn't even been going all out. Did they only come to probe me? But this would be their best opportunity to get rid of me. Why would they only come to probe me? Lionel's gaze narrowed. Something was odd here. Of course, Kira's identity was a bit surprising to him. It had to be remembered that the Silver Empire had been destroyed because of their relation to demons. The fact that Oren had demon blood running through his veins as a Moralis was shocking in and of itself. But to also have contact with the demon race as well? That was definitely a step beyond anything Lionel could have expected. Lionel hadn't said anything about Kira's identity out loud, because of this very reason. In addition, maybe only he could see through such a thing at a glance. He had not only seen demons personally, he had the sensory capabilities to see the true nature of a person's soul. Unless one had a higher dream force affinity than himself, or an extraordinary treasure, it was simply impossible for them to hide their true nature from him. But what was their purpose, exactly? Fate Big Bro Oren, is that all? Kira appeared. By this time, they were already far outside the limits of Lionel's territory, having already crossed a large distance through the ocean. Kira was a bit indignant. It seemed she had wanted to fight some more. This was the second time she had lost to Lionel like that. Oren showed a rare smile and laughed, rubbing Kira's head like she was still a little girl. He's worthy of being our Moralis family's heir. It was just a little test. You didn't even let me use 10% of my strength, though. That's not fair. Oren laughed harder. You're in the 7th dimension. Even if you won, would it be fair? Kira crossed her arms over her chest and pouted. You know my situation. I can't become the heir of the Moralis. It'll only cause them catastrophe. But before I exit stage left, I'll have to deal with another catastrophe first. Oren's gaze turned cold, facing in the direction of Third Nova's territory. He only had one goal here, and that was to deal with that third cousin of his. At that moment, on the Nightside continent, Third Nova stood over the territory of Fourth Nova. Co had suffered a crushing defeat. Chapter 2001. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 2001. Kill. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in silence for a long while. Despite his fatigue, his mind raced at a mile a minute, moving through all sorts of scenarios. Nothing seemed to make perfect sense though. Ultimately, no matter how he sliced it, this was Second Nova's best chance to deal with him. There was no advantage to gain by waiting unless he truly wanted to wait until Lionel was in an even more sorry state than this one. That meant that there was a better than 60% chance that Second Nova hadn't come here with the intention of dealing with him at all. His original intention was just to probe him. And it might even be potentially true that Second Nova planned on giving up on the air wars in their entirety. But if he was willing to give up on the air wars in the first place, then why did he participate? Even if he didn't like the optics of giving up without trying, what was the big difference between that and giving up midway? That seemed to point to the fact that Second Nova wanted to test the airs and pick whomever he liked best. But in that case, why did he vanish? If he had decided on Lionel, then wouldn't he be helping Lionel? What was the intention in just leaving directly? It had to be remembered that each family was limited to 2 heirs, but there was a very obvious exception to this. And that was the Moralis, who had 7 heirs. This was tacitly allowed by the other families for a few reasons. First, the Moralis were already the targets of everyone to begin with. Second, while the others were simply here for glory or to deal with Lionel, the Moralis family heirs were here to fight for the position of heirs. As such, they inherently could not work together as they were competing with one another. The other families would obviously step in if it seemed like the Moralis heirs were teaming up, and it would counter whatever advantage they could gain by doing so. It was probably even best to separate the focus of the families. By doing this, though, this would likely place even more pressure on Lionel, was one of the main focuses to begin with. Why was this all so important? It was because if Oren really wanted to help Lionel, he wouldn't just injure him and then vanish. There were many other things he could do even if he didn't participate himself. Plus, why did he have to test Lionel in the air wars themselves? He had had plenty of opportunities in the last month to meet Lionel privately. All of this pointed to the fact that Oren had something he wanted to do in the air war specifically, and whatever that was, he felt that it was more important than even his chances at becoming an heir. In fact, he might have no intention of becoming an heir in the first place. I'm missing something. What is it? What is it? Lionel didn't like this feeling. Usually, when he didn't have enough information, he wouldn't bother to waste time trying to deduce, but this felt different. He felt that this was too important to ignore, and yet he still didn't have the information he needed to deduce the answer. It was endlessly frustrating. Suddenly, Lionel's gaze sharpened. There was no doubt that Oren was targeting someone that the air wars made much more convenient to target. Who could that person be? That person had to be someone that was difficult to target outside of this place. That seemed to point toward one of the heirs of the other families. But why would targeting a seventh-dimensional existence be so important to Oren? There were only two explanations. Either this seventh-dimensional existence had offended Oren in a way that was far too great for him to ignore, or this seventh-dimensional existence would, in the future, become a world-changing sort of threat. Lionel knew quite a bit about Oren and the other heirs. Oren was the head of an exceptionally powerful information network, but he didn't sell his services. This made sense to many people at the time. After all, they all assumed that he had built it up because of the air wars. But if Oren had never had any intention of becoming an heir, then why did he build an information network he had no intention of profiting from? That led Lionel right back to the first two explanations. Either to find someone who had greatly offended him, or find someone who posed an existential risk to the Morales family, or maybe even the human domain as a whole. Lionel's brows glowed like two torches. He felt his dream force shifting, his simulations becoming sharper and sharper. What if the reason Oren gave up on being an heir was because he knew that his actions would lose him the right? How could a seventh-dimensional existence be an existential threat? They were too weak. Well, how could a sixth-dimensional existence like Lionel possibly have become a threat in the eyes of the powerhouses of the human domain? The explanation was the same. This seventh-dimensional existence had to have the ability to gain access to a power that no one else could. Lionel was a prince of the Ascension Empire and an heir of the Morales family. This was unacceptable in the eyes of many, as they believed that this was just the Morales family laying claim to the only eighth-dimensional territory of the human domain via unscrupulous means. Suddenly it all seemed to click, and the pieces slid into place. Fadem Lionel's aura suddenly flourished, and his strength took a large leap forward. From Tier 7 he stepped into Tier 8, his Dream Force stars gaining more runes as they swirled about with a strong, pulsing, silvery light. He came here to kill. He came here to kill an heir of the Morales. Chapter 2002. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 2002. Who? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze was exceptionally bright at this moment. He felt that things had fallen in line, but this still opened up questions for who it could possibly be, and more importantly, why. Lionel didn't feel that Oren was likely to be a person who acted without cause. In fact, all of his actions seemed to point toward the fact that he was very much prepared for all of this. Those several broken city cores should be his attempts at testing several hypotheses for sneaking into cities without detection. After all, given the territory maps, Lionel could monitor everything in his territory with great ease. That was why he was so comfortable leaving it behind. Then there was his information network. He might have already used several kill exchanges to spread them out across the two supercontinents. That was how he knew exactly where Lionel was, despite the fact Lionel had a decoy city still sitting in the middle of the continent. And he likely knew exactly where his target heir was as well. In fact, this final probe of Lionel before he set off was just a final check to ensure that everything was in line and working perfectly, killing two birds with one stone. This person was meticulous, intelligent, and most importantly, patient. He hadn't even made a move until almost a week had passed in the air wars, and he was still carefully planning even now. Ironically, due to his true demon blood, Oren was even calmer than most Morales, as the lineage factor did affect his mind as much as it did the others. On top of that, he was young, comparatively speaking. Meaning, The Morales lineage factor had yet to impact him nearly as greatly as it did the other Morales ancestors. What was most convincing to Lionel was that just now, he had gotten the final hit in on Oren, and yet the latter didn't feel the need to prove a point. Lionel knew Oren was holding back, and could have made him suffer a loss before leaving, but he hadn't. This wasn't a rash person who couldn't control his own ego. Like this, even without understanding the underlying story, Lionel already believed Oren. But the question was, who was Oren targeting? Lionel's thoughts flickered, his mind settling on one person, Fourth Nova. Lionel deduced that Fourth Nova had the highest odds of being the person Oren was targeting. Back then, Lionel had thought that Fourth Nova wanted to sign Aina to a slave contract just because he thought she was a beauty, but what if it was more than that? Just a few weeks prior to that, hadn't the Three-Finger Cult appeared in an attempt to snatch Aina away, due to her blood sovereignty? What if this was Fourth Nova's goal all along? Lionel's thoughts flowed incredibly smoothly, and he felt his mind making connections that he had never made before. He immediately decided who was the most likely to be Oren's target based on his own biases. The second most likely, Third Nova. I think you should take a look at Lionel's gaze flickered with a cold light. Third Nova had some ties with the Seward family, and had even aided in the collapse of the stalwart Polarm faction back then. These were records that Lionel only learned about after reading through the transcriptions of the Void Senate gatherings. Of course, this wasn't immediately obvious through the Senate filings, but who was Lionel and how good was his deduction skills? Even if the Seward family and the Unfettered Blade Party never admitted it, he didn't need their admission. That timing was also suspicious, because it was also during that time that there was a change to the original True Selection, and the geniuses of the Cataclysm generation were shipped off to the Rapak's nest. This wasn't in any Senate documents as it was a unilateral decision, but this was even easier for Lionel to deduce for one specific reason. His father. Why would his father take Rosen Seward's arm if the Seward family was not related to this? This seemed to paint the picture that Third Nova was in bed with the Seward family, and may have even used this to intentionally target Lionel. Lionel didn't have enough evidence to further connect this to the Three-Finger Cult as the Seward family didn't seem to have any relations to them. If they had, Lionel believed his father would have taken Rosen's head, not his arm. Lionel had quite a lot of belief in his father, that much was obvious. But anyone who had seen the rage in Velasco's eyes when he spoke of the Three-Finger Cult, and the things they had done to his father and Lionel's grandfather would likewise understand. It was because of this that Lionel placed Third Nova a step beneath Fourth Nova. A Morales heir with ties to the Three-Finger Cult versus a Morales heir that was a puppet of the Seward family. Both were absolutely terrible, but one was still clearly worse than the other. Of course, this also made the assumption that Oren knew of the Three-Finger Cult, and could even find their tail in this fashion. But Lionel didn't feel that this was a great leap at all. Lionel had deduced long ago that it seemed that the Three-Finger Cult, the Silver Empire and the Morales family had an odd line connecting them all. Why were the lineage factors of the Silver Empire and Morales family so similar? Why were the both seemingly related to demons? Why was it that of all the ancestors that the Three-Finger Cult could have targeted to kill, they would choose his grandfather? He hadn't found any information of the Three-Finger Cult being so bold with anyone else. Then there was the most obvious thing. Oren had demon blood, and seemed to be mixed in the middle of all of this. If there was any Morales heir aware of the Three-Finger Cult, and maybe understood some of these underlying secrets, would it be him? Chapter 2003. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 6 seconds AM. Chapter 2003. Devastating if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The third most likely was Sixth Nova. And that was only because Lionel knew the least about him, while the fourth was First Nova. Sixth Nova was an unknown variable, while First Nova was the son of the current patriarch. The latter faced almost too much scrutiny on the daily basis to avoid detection of the masses. But the real question was, what would Lionel do about this? Given the strength of Kira and Oren, he didn't think anyone of the Umbra family could follow them covertly. The best he could do was monitor the general situation of the Nightside supercontinent. But what if he failed? Lionel's brow furrowed. Just as he was thinking, several flashes entered the city lord's mansion. He didn't even need to look to know that it was the Umbra family. They were actually a day late, but he didn't berate them. If there wasn't a good reason, they wouldn't be. Lionel had originally expected them back yesterday, but the fact they had only come today wasn't bad news. It was actually good news. It meant there was information to be had. As expected, after Radlees began his report, Lionel's gaze narrowed. When he got to the end, Lionel's entire perspective shifted. Fourth Nova fell? Lionel's heart skipped a beat. This could only mean that his deduction was wrong. If the number one threat to Orin could fall to Third Nova's hands so easily, then Orin would have never had to put in so much effort in the first place. Lionel had a hard time believing that someone as powerful as Orin, and more importantly intelligent, would put so much effort into something that was such a non-factor. The only explanation was that Fourth Heaven wasn't the true threat. The true threat was Third Nova. Third Nova's forces were too overwhelming. He had exaggerated numbers under his wing, and they were all of exceptional strength. Fourth Nova didn't even last very long before he was directly kicked out. After that, his actions caused a cascade of events. Sixth Nova fell not long afterward, and it's somewhat unknown how this happened. Originally, Sixth Nova was stuck between the spiritual faith and the Omen Empire, but neither seemed to have been the ones to take him out. He just suddenly vanished and his territory crumbled not long after. Lionel frowned. Could it be that Second Nova had gone after Sixth Nova? Was he wrong about his intentions all along? Then again, it might also be a method of protecting Sixth Nova. Aside from him, Sixth Nova was the youngest, and he was most definitely the weakest among them all after the strength Lionel had seen Fifth Nova display. This wasn't the fault of Sixth Nova, he was just disadvantaged. He had only just entered the seventh dimension, and most of his subordinates weren't up to par. He faced similar issues to Lionel. More than just himself had been screwed over by the delay in the air wars. But would Third Nova really dare to kill? At the end of the day, Patriarch of the Morales family was just a temporary position, and one could almost be considered a figurehead. The ones who held the real power in the family were still the ancestors. Just by becoming the Patriarch, Third Nova couldn't just hand over the reins of the family to the Seward family. Even if there were family rules protecting Third Nova, given the fiery tempers of the Morales ancestor, would he even last a day past a single reckless decision? That was when Lionel's expression suddenly changed. I think you should take a look at that. Was right. The checks and balances of the Morales family were so impossibly sturdy. There was an underlying threat here that he wasn't seeing. An underlying threat that made Second Nova entirely unwilling to see Third Nova even have the chance. Lionel's gaze suddenly became frighteningly cold. Third Nova had made an enemy he wasn't even expecting to have made. Not only would Lionel defeat him, he wouldn't hesitate to kill him. Worst came to worst, if Lionel interrogated his soul and found that he was wrong, he would simply revive him. But from what it seemed like now, although he didn't have the evidence, Third Nova was tied to something exceptionally sinister. Orin could have never guessed that just a single probing attack of Lionel, an encounter that lasted no more than a few minutes, would actually give the latter this much information. As for whether this was a good thing or not, only time would tell. After Sixth Nova fell, there was a huge shift in the land. He had controlled a great deal of territory, and with his disappearance after his badge was crushed, all of his subordinates vanished as well. The other territories attempted to swallow it up, leading to a whole host of battles, of which it seemed that First Nova came on top. Third Nova had been occupied by his battle with Fourth Nova, and didn't receive the information until much later. By the time he marched over, the land had already been divided. The only powers worthy of note left on the Nightside continent are First Nova, Third Nova, the Spiritual Faith, the Omen, the Seward family, the Ram family and the Pious family. Lionel's gaze flickered. Could it be that Second Nova had taken out Sixth Nova to cause this abrupt change? His timing was even so perfect. With Third Nova occupied by Fourth Nova, the one who gained the most advantage was First Nova and Third Nova was late to react. What is the Seward family up to? Why does it feel like you have so little information about them? Lionel couldn't help but realize this. Also, he hadn't quite abandoned the idea that Third Nova was tied to them. With one being so active and the other being so silent, it felt suspicious. It doesn't seem that the Seward family has done much, but they are currently preparing to form the first gold-grade territory of that continent. Although I can't be certain, it seems that their trust in their heir is exceptionally high. They aren't using any schemes or plans. Until this point, they've crushed everything in their path with pure strength. It seems like they're waiting for something. Lionel fell into silence. Something was brewing. He had already expected the air wars to come with a ton of extra baggage, but this single encounter with Second Nova had blasted open a door that he hadn't expected. These air wars and the aftermath would be more devastating than he had imagined. Lionel didn't know how right he was at that moment. Chapter 2004. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 3 seconds AM. Chapter 2004. Entirely. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel didn't reply. He tried to think, but he felt his mind was growing foggy. After a moment of thought, he realized that it was best if he entered the pod now. If there was another attack, he wouldn't even be able to stand straight, let alone deal with it. After 15 minutes had passed, Lionel stepped out feeling refreshed and invigorated. His eyes carried much more clarity within them, and he could feel the changes to his dream force more substantially. He had actually stepped into the second layered state. This was a bit of a surprise. Although Lionel had already felt that he was close, he hadn't expected that pushing his dream simulation so far would allow him to take such a step. Even so, he greatly welcomed it, though he felt that he had to be more careful. Dream force was only a small part of his emulation spatial force. Having such high control of dream force while lagging in spatial force, while it wouldn't impact him negatively physically, might skew his comprehension of emulation spatial force down an improper path in the future. Suddenly Lionel froze. No, I've been thinking about all of this incorrectly to begin with. Lionel's dreamscape sparked with greater vigor as his eyes glowed. Now that his mind wasn't fatigued, the benefits of the improvements to his dream force and its positive impact on his ability index breathed a lung of fresh air into Lionel's body. His mind jumped and sparks of lightning connected force crafting, the life grade and his emulation spatial force, a wild series of connections that seemed completely irrelevant together. But to Lionel, it made all the sense in the world. A force, its existence, is just an exhibit of the life grade. Wise Star Order already implied this when he described the existence of Scarlet Star Force to me. The reason it's dangerous for my innate nodes to be so perfect and complete, and yet for my comprehension of it to be lacking, is precisely because this force has a life of its own. It has a disposition, a personality of sorts, born from its own uniqueness. In that case, why would emulation spatial force be different? The unique characteristic of the life grade is that it had left behind its individual parts and become something entirely different. Although it is true that emulation spatial force is formed of dream force and spatial force, considering it as the sum of its parts rather than something exponentially different will only hold me back. Lionel's gaze glowed, and the back of his neck glowed with a silvery gold. Suddenly he tapped at the air before him. A wide net appeared before him, but it became clear soon that it was less of a net and more of a grid. This grid of perfect cubes began to bend and warp. It looked almost like a simulation of gravity and the impact great masses had on space and its nodes. The nodes began to shift and change, and if one paid close attention, it would be possible to see that Lionel was repeating the pattern of slight distortion around his own body. One after another, a perfect replica of the distortions continued to multiply, again and then again. Lionel's gaze glowed. His outstretched finger flipped, and he suddenly snapped his finger. Right at that moment the golden grid was flooded with a silvery flame. At that moment, the distortions solidified and one perfect replica of Lionel appeared after another. Soon, the entire City Lord Manor was filled with clones of Lionel. Up above the Air Wars world, few were still paying attention to Lionel in the grand scheme. But when it came to the most important figures, although fireworks were going off on the night side continent, none of them left Lionel for more than a few minutes at a time. I think you should take a look at when they saw him break into Tier 8 seemingly just standing and thinking. Their pupils couldn't help but constrict. There didn't seem to be anything logical about his breakthrough. Only Ancestor Hito could sense the sudden eruption of Lionel's dream force. He had comprehended something profound that allowed him to take such a step. But for Lionel to comprehend something like that right after a battle, and in such a tired state, just what kind of monster was he exactly? It didn't make any sense. However, this change shocked them even more than before. The reason for that was simple. They couldn't tell which one was the real Lionel. And this included Ancestor Hito, who had formed this world in the first place. Each clone was so perfect that they all felt like the real Lionel. They had seen Lionel use clones already in this war, but they had always been able to easily tell what was happening. But now Lionel's clones suddenly all vanished, and to their shock, the real Lionel, the one they had been locked onto all the while, wasn't there at all. Just when they were wondering where he could have possibly gone, their hearts trembled. There, by a pillar of the hall, Lionel stood with a light smile on his face. If they remembered correctly, that was the location of where another clone had been just moments before. That was when it hit them. Lionel had swapped with one of his clones seamlessly, and they hadn't even been able to notice it happened. It had to be remembered that the images they were seeing now were absolutely perfect. There were no details missing. Lionel might as well have been standing right in front of them at the moment. And yet, even as eighth-dimensional existences, they didn't notice the change. It had been perfectly seamless. Lionel didn't seem to care despite the fact he knew others were observing him. He realized his approach had been wrong. He kept thinking of Scarlet Star Force like it was a fire force. It wasn't fire at all. It was fire, star, and light force. Unless he could fuse those concepts in his mind, he had no right to try and define it. This was also the case for his Void Star Force and his Vital Star Force. His perspective on the world seemed to shift entirely. Chapter 2005. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 2005. New path. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel tapped a finger at the air again. At that moment, a wisp of blue appeared. In one moment, it seemed like a liquid, but then it became like a gaseous fog. Sometimes like that fog was viscous. At other times it was as fleeting as the wind. Lionel stared intently. He couldn't seem to decide on a form. After a moment, he waved his hand and let it disperse. He realized after a few seconds that he didn't know nearly enough about Void Star Force to make such a decision, and by extension he likely didn't know enough about Vital Star Force either. Although he understood what he had to do, taking the actual steps was too difficult. That said, Lionel tapped the air, and a flickering red-gold flame appeared. However, he almost instantly understood that it was wrong. The flickering flame changed, becoming more and more solid. In the blink of an eye, it went from the wisp of a flame to a solid rotating ball. Every time it rotated, an echo of destruction flew out in a wave. It felt far more powerful, but somehow not quite right either. Lionel's gaze narrowed and suddenly the solid sphere became covered by a sea of flames. One state of solid and another of fire and gas, supplemented by a hidden layer of echoing silence. It didn't crackle, it didn't pop. A frightening sort of silence enveloped everything. With a clench of his fist, the Scarlet Star Force became a spear. A solid rod formed beneath the raging flames. A blade formed with a glass-like consistency, one could see right through it. And yet, with just a tap to the ground, the foundation of the City Lord Manor seemed to be on the verge of collapsing entirely. So that means Lionel grabbed at the air with another hand, a dark blue spear forming. However, it didn't seem quite right. It was then it suddenly clicked. With a slight shift, the foundation of the dark blue force became an amorphous blob, rotating like a black hole. What was odd was that the center felt completely malleable. However, just before one reached the core, it was entirely solid. The suction force became so strong near it that everything, even the air itself, solidified. If one had paid attention, it would have been clear that this was simply the inversion of what Lionel had done with his Scarlet Star Force, and it suddenly slipped into place. Bang! Suddenly, Lionel's Void Star Force stars and Scarlet Star Force stars appeared on their own, their runes rotating to life. Lionel's irises began to glow, one with a fierce red-gold glow, and the other with a fierce blue-black. His hair fluttered. Despite the fact he had only just entered Tier 8, his aura surged once again and he entered Tier 9. His aura seemed to want to soar past that, but there was simply nowhere to go. His force spilled over in waves, the city trembling again and again. Lionel couldn't seem to hold back. He raised his head to the skies, unleashing a roar. I think you should take a look at the waves of the ocean near his city rose like a tsunami. However, just when it seemed that it would swallow his city whole, it seemed to have crashed into an invisible dome. It was sent flying back with even greater speed, splitting the ocean tides into two to the point the barren bottom of the ocean could be seen for dozens of miles. Lionel's palm flipped over as a spear appeared in his hand. The blade rod expanded and a menacing blade formed. With a step through the air, Lionel appeared high in the skies, thrusting out his spear. His blade tip vanished, and he seemed to have pierced out dozens of times in a single instant. Lionel's stance shifted and his spear swung. A beautiful spear dance overwhelmed the skies. Every time Lionel moved, the clouds above would split. After several moments, a gorgeous pattern appeared within him. The wind moved with his breath, space bent to his movements, time paused with his sight. A complex force art continuously grew beneath his feet. It seemed to respond to his spear dance, forming gentle strokes with his soft movement and thick gauges with his powerful eruptions. Lionel felt like a god upholding the skies. There didn't seem to be a division between the air he thrust through, the skies above and the earth below. Every time he attacked, it was as though his blade covered everything in the plane. And soon the beautiful pattern appearing in the clouds above also began to form on the ground below. The Morales watching this spear dance felt their spears hum. Those with the spear domain lineage factor couldn't even control themselves as their spear crowns appeared above their heads, their irises flickering with raging spear force that wanted to howl into the skies above. Their hearts moved with Lionel's every swing, their breaths caught in their throats. It had all clicked for Lionel at once. It was all connected. Indeed, the life grade had always been the guiding lamp. The moment he had thought that his force arts would be the secret to the next evolution of his spear, he had been correct. He just hadn't known what the foundation would be. But now he knew. Lionel's gaze sharpened as his spear pierced into the skies. His entire being moved as one. The clouds above and the ground below glowed, the force art beneath his feet suddenly expanding to the point that it dwarfed the city below it. The spear howl seemed to be heard throughout the human domain. It tore through the canopy, forming the maw of a dragon as it soared, striking through the starry skies above. It was the kind of strike that would be indelibly marked in the memories of all those who saw it. It was a statement bolder than arrogance, louder than words, timeless and ageless. It was the strike of a new path of the spear. Chapter 2006. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:54 a.m. Chapter 2006. Over 20 years later, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The hearts of the various ancestors palpitated. That strike. That strike. Why did they feel like it was so dangerous? It was the kind of strike they were confident they could deal with. But it was also the kind of strike they felt that if they were too casual with, they would be forced to suffer a small loss. It could most definitely draw blood. How was that possible? At that moment, Lionel's words from a month ago echoed in their minds once again. Indeed, if they had allowed him to step into the seventh dimension, where would the suspense be? Right before their eyes, Lionel had gone from Tier 7 to Tier 8, and then Tier 9 just 20 minutes later. It should have taken years to cross barriers of the sixth dimension. Lionel had given the others a 20-year head start, and most of them had only barely stepped into Tier 1 of the seventh dimension. Watching a man go through 2 tiers in not even an hour. How could they accept this? What made it worse is how Lionel broke through. This confirmed to them all that it was simply impossible for him to have taken the conventional path. Lionel had obviously used comprehension to break through, and that wasn't possible with the conventional path, which was entirely about tempering the body. He would have needed to consume some resources before he could break through, but they had all been watching him. He had clearly not consumed anything. For one's comprehension to be so strong, could even the likes of Cynthia and Velasco compare? Velasco wasn't even 30 years old when he entered the 7th dimension, just like Lionel. However, what no one realized was that Lionel didn't even know what dimensions were until he was 18 years old, whereas Velasco had been born and raised in the Morales family. It was simply impossible to compare these two things. He had to die. Lionel lowered his spear, his gaze still sparkling. He had never unleashed such a powerful strike before. It felt good. With that strike alone, he had reached the 4th layered state, just a step away from the impetus stage. It had to be remembered that the impetus stage was the requirement for entering the 9th heaven. To even approach such a state was absolutely game-changing. However, Lionel wasn't complacent. For one, to unleash that attack, he needed to complete his spear dance. Right now, his methods were imperfect, so he first had to draw the power of several strikes before converging them into one. The process of drawing the force art currently shrinking beneath his feet, right now wasn't small. At the moment, it took over 10,000 strokes of his spear to reach this perfect state. In battle at his level, that would take several minutes to achieve, around 5 minutes or so. This wasn't very long normally, but a lot could happen in a battle, the most obvious of which would be his ritual being interrupted. And obviously, a person who he needed to use such a strike against would be more than capable of interrupting him. The second problem was that this was the 4th layered state for a mere 6th dimensional spear force. If he improved to a 7th dimensional spear force now, he would only be able to touch the 3rd layered state with this spear dance. And Lionel had no intention of holding back his spear force just for this. There was good news though. I think you should take a look at when he began his spear dance. Each and every one of his spear strikes was at the limit of the 3rd layer, individually more powerful than almost any other technique he had. This meant that while he was accumulating, it wasn't as though he couldn't threaten his opponent. In fact, he would be likely to shred an enemy to pieces before he could even unleash the final attack. But then there was more bad news. Lionel wasn't quite sure how to translate this to his bow. With his spear he could use his spear dance, but with his bow he could only stand in place and draw his bowstring. He would be a sitting duck. When would he have the time to stand around for 5 minutes in battle without attacking? For the first time, his spear had actually surpassed his archery, at least in this regard. Luckily, there was more good news. There were 2 paths before him to improve now. The first was simplifying the force art. The second was strengthening it, decreasing the number of lines for the former, and potentially adding layers of complexity for the latter. In addition, this was just one spear dance. Lionel felt that he could create more with differing aspects. This one was particularly overbearing. It was like a beast rampaging within its cage and pulling against its chains, roaring when it finally made its way out. If he could create several spear dances, each with their own unique flair, he could one day enter a state of battle where he never had to step out of his spear dances at all. He could glide from one spear dance to the next, seamlessly using them. If he reached such a state, it would be almost impossible to interrupt a spear dance because he could just flow into another. If it was himself flowing from one to the next, he wouldn't lose any progress. That way, he could incrementally complete one spear dance at a time, until he had gathered so much momentum that he could bulldoze his opponents. In fact, maybe one day he would even be able to fuse the final strikes of his spear dances into one, creating an ultimate attack that was simply unblockable. Lionel's spear trembled once and he took a breath, exhaling. He looked down at the heavy black rod in his hands. In the past, just trying to catch it had crushed his fingers, but now he could hear it roar. Just now, Lionel had finally sensed the domain of the black rod and he couldn't help but grin. Over 20 years ago, he had given up the Shadow Sovereign lineage factor and chose to protect an unborn child. 20 years later, things seemed to have come full circle. Who could have known that he had had Shadow Sovereignty in the palm of his hands all the while? Chapter 2007. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:53 and 58 seconds AM Chapter 2007. Good timing if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel's gaze shifted to the force art slowly shrinking beneath his feet. He realized that he probably had one more strike in him if he did so now, but it would only be about half as strong as the one just now. Depending on the situation in battle, I'll have to adjust that. Whether I grow more efficient at releasing it all at once, or hold back on the first strike so that I can have a second. Either way, I'll just have to keep those thoughts tucked in the back of my mind. Lionel subtly nodded to himself and stepped down from the skies. In the past, he still had to rely on his emulation spatial force to step into the air, but he could now do it on his own. Aside from those with flying ability indexes, he was probably the only one of the sixth dimension who could do this without relying on force itself, but rather a comprehension of force. This, though, made it clearer to Lionel the kind of gap that existed between the sixth and seventh dimensions. He still remembered a time he could just barely battle against those of the fifth dimension when he was still in the third. But now this small gap had actually caused him so much trouble. From the sixth dimension onward, every step was fundamentally different and world-changing. Flying was an ability only those who used the God path and had stepped into the seventh dimension could perform. There was something metaphysical that changed in a person's being. Lionel had stepped into that realm just now relying on his comprehension, but others had undergone this change with their bodies. When this was put into perspective, the large gap between what seemed to be just a single step made much more sense. On the ground, Radley shook his head. He had just stepped out from a pod himself as these last 2 days had been really taxing for him. He didn't expect to see Lionel entering Tier 9 right before his eyes. It had to be remembered that not even a year ago, he had witnessed Lionel going from Tier 1 to Tier 3 right before his eyes, and now he was already in Tier 9, right after he had already stepped into Tier 8. It would be easier to accept if he had taken the conventional path, but this was very clearly not that. His aura was too powerful and his momentum was far too stifling. Radley's had never met anyone in the first tiers of the seventh dimension with a stronger aura than Lionel. By the time Lionel had landed, his light smile had vanished into the same cold expression he had carried for much of the air wars. He could allow the time he had just wasted to go because he had exchanged it for more strength, but in general he didn't want to waste any more time. Now that he was in Tier 9, he had much more confidence. The only unfortunate part was that he didn't have the next layers of dimensional cleanse. To Lionel, the actual process of going through tiers didn't necessitate dimensional cleanse, but the breakthrough process did. In addition, Lionel had yet to fully comprehend the sixth dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse either. He had done so for the fifth dimensional layer, allowing him to pass it on to others, but he had yet to even actively practice the sixth dimensional layer, let alone comprehend it. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. He simply had too much to do and he was always busy. If not for his sharp comprehension, making it to Tier 9 in such a short time would have been nothing more than a good joke. Lionel slotted this matter to the back of his mind. It seemed like just as he had with the fifth dimensional layer, he would have to practice it last minute. That said, that didn't mean that he had no idea of how he might proceed forward. After all, dimensional cleanse was clearly very closely tied with the universal cycle comprehension and methods of the Cataclysm Zone. Panda's novel. This meant that the next step likely involved taking his stars and crossing from the heavenly body realm into the natural light realm. Then to enter the seventh dimension he would need to shatter them and enter the cosmos realm. If that was the case, even if he wanted to, Lionel wouldn't be able to practice the sixth dimensional layer of dimensional cleanse. That was because he still hadn't gained enlightenment on the natural light realm. Radley's continue to monitor the situation on the night side continent. I'll provide the points. I want you to build a bride of outposts between the edge of our territory and the opposing shoreline. Use those outposts as your method of quickly returning here. I want a report every 6 hours. You can connect it right here. Lionel pointed out several things on the map and then relayed a few more orders. After he was done, he sent Radley's and the other members of the Umbra family away. Outposts could only be set up such that some part of their range was within a range of territory you already owned. So Lionel had no choice but to waste the points needed to build an entire bridge across the ocean just for the sake of this convenience. But right now, information was extremely important to him. In addition, given the fact that the outposts would be hidden under the ocean's tides, the likelihood of them being found was minimal. And even if they were found, so what? He really wanted to see who would dare to attack him casually right now. Lionel's gaze flashed with a fierce light. At that moment, several teleportation signals were received and flashes of light rippled out, as those Lionel had sent out to clear the challenges and dungeons began to return. Lionel nodded to himself. This timing was good. He would take the time to maximize the rewards they had gained first before heading out to hunt more air-grade threats. Chapter 2008. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:53 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 2008. Huge deal if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. The first thing the others brought back was quite interesting. It was a water freezing reward. It was exceptionally difficult to freeze salted water for obvious reasons, and oceans in higher dimensional worlds were even more resistant to such things. The Air Wars planet had poles, but they weren't frozen over as one might expect, or more accurately, the waters that ran through it weren't. This wasn't only because the waters were salted, but also because the ocean of this world was akin to a very wide river, constantly moving about and orbiting the planet. The freeze reward came from an air-grade dungeon, and it could be used in two ways. The first was to build a bridge. If Lionel wanted to, he could build an ice bridge from his current territory to the other side of the ocean. This bridge would be exceptionally deep and thick. Destroying it would be hundreds of times more difficult than breaking down the walls of an air-grade city. The second use case was to build an ice island. This island would be even more immutable and nigh indestructible. Though its range would obviously be much shorter than that of the ice bridge, it would still be about 10 kilometers in diameter. In addition, this ice island would come with its own city core, allowing one to build a territory upon it. This city would be unique. Rather than receiving 100 times reduction to one's territory, the reduction would only be 10 times. This meant if Lionel had a city transfer reward and displaced his city to the ice island, the 2,000-kilometer range he had that had been limited to 20 kilometers would become 200 kilometers instead. This was quite an exceptional benefit. After all, Lionel had to spend 30 billion points previously to gain just 300 kilometers of range. He would gain two-thirds of that essentially for free if he could get a transfer reward. The width of the ocean was easily over 500 kilometers. It wrapped around the entire planet as well, so its length was easily over 3,000 kilometers. Even so, this would go a long way. If Lionel could block out a section of the ocean with more than just outposts, the benefit would be exceptional, and also stop others from encroaching without a willingness to bear arms. Even so, Lionel set this matter aside for a small time. The next reward was actually quite an excellent one. It was an air-grade protector. This was worth a great deal. An air-grade protector was worth easily 10 of just one of the soul constructs he had gathered until now. Even better than that, their defensive abilities were off the charts, so ultimately, their combat strength was better than just the estimate of 10 Lionel had. It would probably be able to deal with a fifth of the air-grade generals come the air-grade upgrade challenge. Lionel crushed the rewards and released it, allowing it to join the other lower-grade protectors. Though they were invisible for now, when the time came they should be quite useful. The next few rewards were miscellaneous, but useful nonetheless. This included an air-grade city wall collapse reward, a territory expanding reward, and a gold-grade upgrade pass. The territory expanding reward was especially interesting because it was air-grade. It allowed one to expand their territory as though one already had an air-grade city. The territory of an air-grade city was measured differently. The gold grade had a limit of 2,000 kilometers even after one exchanged points for more expansion. But an air-grade territory encompassed a continent. Meaning if Lionel used this reward, so long as there weren't the territories of others present, his territory would expand to engulf a continent. The trouble with this, though, was that Lionel's goal was obviously the ocean, and this reward wouldn't allow him to claim the entire ocean for obvious reasons. But as a reward from an ocean dungeon, there was obviously a provision for it to be used in this fashion. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. Calmness was when Lionel learned that the ocean was split into 4 seas according to this description, each sea taking up 1/4 of its length. According to the reward, if he attached this territory expansion to a special ocean territory, he would be able to claim up to an entire sea for himself. Lionel's gaze flickered when he read through this. That was because he had access to one such thing already, and that would be the Ice Island City. That said, there was a bit of a drawback. He would only be able to claim half of a sea with a gold-grade city. In order to claim a whole sea, he would need an air-grade territory. Lionel fell into thought. He had access to more than enough cities now, although he didn't use them. There was his decoy city which he could upgrade now with his gold-grade upgrade pass. After that, he would only need to find one more city to trigger the air-grade upgrade challenge. Panda's novel a calm, but there were 2 major problems with this. First, this would obviously make the air-grade upgrade challenge 3 times more difficult, and he was still accumulating to challenge even the base-level challenge. Unfortunately, he was still an enormous amount of points away from being able to afford it, and he was constantly spending points now, the Bride of Outposts just being one matter. The second issue was that challenging with a special ocean territory meant that he would have to deal with oceanic beasts instead of land beasts. They would be a huge headache for obvious reasons, and his formation wasn't here to support him. However, claiming an entire city was a huge deal. That was especially since this reward didn't say anything about being limited by the territories of others. That likely meant that even if there was someone encroaching on his sea right this moment, they would be kicked out. This was a huge deal. Lionel fell into silence. Chapter 2009. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:55 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 2009. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2009. Battle intent. Lionel had to function with the assumption that if he could accomplish something, although he was ahead now, that didn't mean others couldn't accomplish it in the future. In fact, there were probably multiple paths to accomplish the same thing. That meant in the future there would likely be others claiming seas, and Lionel knew that he had to be one of them. More importantly, he had to be the first among them. Right now, the only advantage he had outside of his own combat strength was that he was the first to form a gold-grade territory. But if he was complacent, soon, others would begin to catch up. If he idled any longer, his advantage would be swallowed up. This was why he had taken the risk to march on the Dayside continent in the first place. However, this decision was still many times more difficult. The simple fact was that he didn't see a simple path toward clearing the air-grade upgrade challenge, let alone 3 times it. He had fought the air-grade threats personally just now. They were monsters. With the improvements to his strength, he could likely take one down easily now, but a single wave would have 100, a fusion challenge would have 300. Most of his subordinates couldn't battle even a single gold-grade threat, let alone 300 air-grade threats. That didn't mention the other elephant in the room, 100 million gold-grade threats, or 300 million in this case. That was the population of a decently sized country back on Earth. In the grand scheme of the human domain, it was a small number, but it was a crushing mountain to the current Lionel. Even if he had the option, he wouldn't be able to control that many soul constructs either, even if he factored in the recent improvement to his dream force. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, closing his eyes. This had to be done. The only thought process now should be figuring out how. His eyes snapped open and his focus seemed to have increased. He scanned through the remaining rewards, most of which were still miscellaneous, until he landed on one. This reward was in the shape of a conch one could blow into. There were 2 options. The first was to summon 10 air-grade threats. The other was to summon 1 million gold-grade threats. All of them would be oceanic beasts. Lionel's gaze narrowed. It seems that I'll have to bring out one more of my trump cards. Those watching likely had no idea just how much Lionel was holding back currently. He had many methods that he hadn't used, but that was because he was aware that he was being observed and his goal was never just to win the air wars. His eyes had been on the war that was doubtless to follow once he did win. In his eyes, This was nothing more than a precursor. But in order to assure his victory, it seemed he would have to bring out a bit more. He raised the conch to his lips. His chest expanded and he practically roared into its body. A billowing sound that caused the ocean to become agitated echoed time and time again. Then he lowered it. You all go and rest. When you feel refreshed, continue with the same plan. We'll keep pushing forward like this. There'll only be just one slight change. The rewards from dungeons are less predictable, and there's no reproducibility. Focus on challenges for now. Namely challenges with the highest possibility of producing upgrade clear rewards. Once we've found one more gold grade upgrade challenge clear reward, and a territory displacement reward, change your focus back to dungeons. The others nodded and Lionel handed a ring to Aina. Aina, these are the corpses of the air grade threats I've dealt with until now. From now on I won't kill them. Is this enough? Aina swept her senses into it and looked up with a nod. It's enough. This will last me a very long time. Good. Lionel nodded before flickering and vanishing. Lionel appeared on the tall city walls, looking down to the churning waters below. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. Come one after another, large oceanic beasts began to appear. Each was at least 20 meters large, and they were all stingrays glistening with a silvery black color. Panda's novel. These stingrays were all gold-grade threats, and with the conch by his side, they were all under Lionel's control. Lionel hopped down from the city walls and landed on the back of one. He inspected it for a moment before diving below the raging waters. The scene below could only be described as fascinating. These stingrays went for as far as the eye could see, especially in these dark waters. Their majesty was great and their beauty greater. But this wouldn't do much to help Lionel. He tested it just now and the amount of control he had over these stingrays was incredibly limited. At Beast, he could point them toward a direction to attack, and he could group them up. As for how they attacked, that was left up to them. This army of 1,000,000 seemed majestic, but they would get chewed up and spit out by an army of 300 million. Even the 3 million from Lionel's gold grade challenge would have laid waste to them. However, Lionel still inspected them all one by one. If one was paying attention to his mind, it would be possible to see a perfect replica of each stingray being carefully slotted away. They were accurate down the finest millimeter, completely flawless. After several moments, Lionel resurfaced. He commanded the stingrays to stay near the surface and avoid running into the territory of the ocean beasts below. If he lost a few of them for a stupid reason, it would be too late to regret. Lionel appeared back with his city and exhaled a breath. Each stingray was a slightly different size. It seemed that he couldn't rely on the segmented cube this time. Although it might be possible to create something simple like a collar with an adjustable size and mass-produce it that way, the effects wouldn't be what he wanted. The power would be limited. Lionel's gaze glowed. It seemed he would have to act personally again. As for Lionel's plan, it was about time he put an idea that had been swimming in mind to action. Back in the Cataclysm Zone, he had seen a concept for armors that could allow troops to fuse their power into one and output more strength than just the sum of their parts. It was akin to working in formation, but with warriors being the nodes instead of something else. If he wanted to clear the air grade upgrade challenge as quickly as possible, he would have to create an army of gold grade threats that could destroy a threat 300 times their size. Little Tolly squirmed from its position on Lionel's wrist, clearly feeling Lionel's battle intent. Or maybe it should be called crafting intent. A cold smile spread across Lionel's lips. These old bastards would have to watch carefully now. The #1 crafter of the younger generation had been him for a very long while. If they truly thought he had opponents, they would be in for a rude awakening. Chapter 2010. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:55 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 2010. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2010. True talent. Little Tolly snaked out from around Lionel's wrist, spreading into the skies. This little one had been noticed by everyone long ago, but it only now seemed to click that Lionel didn't have the slightest protection on his body. He came into direct contact with little Tali without the slightest worry. His synergy with his metal spirit was as high as it could be. But what was maybe even more shocking than this was the fact little Tali was still only in the 5th dimension. What was Lionel planning to do with such a weak metal spirit? They had seen Lionel use little Tali before, but back then Lionel was only bending a metal alloy into shape, and that metal wasn't necessarily designed to be hard and sturdy. It was only created for the sake of facilitating his dream world. But now Lionel's gaze flashed. He didn't even seem intent on using a workbench. In his mind, several blueprints flashed and then vanished before flashing once again. He refined, shattered, and then rebuilt. Lionel tapped at the air as little Tali circled his neck before rising high into the skies. At that moment, the grid of his emulation spatial force appeared once again. Quickly, Lionel's settled upon design began to appear. It was in the shape of an odd winged armor. There was a strong spine that ran down the back and looked like a sapphire blue set of spinal bones locked into one another. Each ended in a menacing blade, and despite the fact it was just a projection, the sharpness seemed to tear into the eyes of those watching. After a moment of astonishment, it suddenly clicked. This sort of armor wasn't for humans, it was for the stingrays. Their eyes couldn't help but open wide. That was impossible. Setting aside the fact creating an armor you weren't used to was an almost impossible task, doing so for 1,000,000 existence was an endeavor that should have taken years of effort. Even if you sped it up, it should take months. Even if you completed an armor a second, completing 1,000,000 of them would take over a week, nearing 2. Let alone the fact it would take several hours to complete just one. Even if you managed to complete one an hour, a pace that could only be said to be blazing, it would take over a century. They couldn't fathom what Lionel was trying to do. Even if he had a method to speed up these timetables by several factors, several months would still be an overly exaggerated estimate. But even then, several months might be enough time for the entire air wars to come to an end. At that point, should Lionel have a better go-to than this? Unless this was really all he had. The Morales ancestors could only sigh. Lionel had truly done quite excellently until now, but much more couldn't be asked of him. If he was in the 7th dimension, the winner seemed to be clear to them already. But even though he was in Tier 9 now, even if it was adjusted for his insane speed, several months would be an outrageous estimate for how fast he could enter the 7th dimension. Most were stuck for decades to even centuries at this step. Even the Cataclysm generation geniuses were stuck for at least 5 to 7 years on average at that step. However, right then, Lionel began to move. Panda's novel. Calm, his arms flared out and his hands trembled once. A golden glow formed a layer of his hands before separating. Right then, a perfect replica of Lionel's hands appeared in the air beside his reals once. Then there was a second glow, then a third. I think you should take a look at Panda's novel. Come in the blink of an eye, 999 pairs of hands appeared in the skies, with Lionel's own making exactly 1,000. You can handle it, right, little guy? Bloop bloop. Little Tali's body shuddered once before a raging torrent formed. The skies seemed to be blotted out by a silvery tsunami, casting a shadow over a large swath of the city. Lionel grinned. Little Tali might still be in the 5th dimension, but it was only ever fed the highest quality materials. Its foundation was incredibly solid, and the only reason it hadn't entered the 6th dimension was because Lionel was still trying to find a force eruption to allow it the perfect evolution. Metal spirits were exceptionally dangerous existences. They could even swallow planets if they were allowed to rampage unchecked. There was a reason Lionel's casual actions around it were seen as so shocking. And now, Lionel had fully unleashed it. Little Tali could already break into dozens of pieces back when Lionel was still in the 3rd dimension. But now, even breaking into 1,000 wasn't a problem. Lionel's gaze glowed and countless ores appeared in the air. He had traded for so many with his points until now that he hadn't even used up 1/10 of what he had in reserve. He had more than he knew what to do with, and they were about to be of great use. Lionel's 1,000 pair of hands flexed just once, and as though striking down toward the keys of a piano, they shattered the sound barrier on the way down, a roar that echoed across the continent and through the oceans, rising in a torrent. Bang, bang, bang. Little Tolly's countless pieces surged forward, its processing speed under Lionel's control immaculate. A heartfelt silence reigned. It felt as though there was simply nothing else to say. Seeing Lionel's skill for the first time, Cynthia's expression changed for the first time, her heart skipping a beat. They had all seen Lionel break through in emulation spatial force together. This meant that Lionel had only just gained the skill to use several pairs of hands like this so seamlessly. And yet he was not only skilled enough to execute such a thing, but he was also doing so with such confidence. How much self-assurance must one have to try something you had never done before with your fate on the line, before the eyes of trillions? It was then that she realized the scariest thing about Lionel wasn't his lineage, nor was it his talent. Chapter 2011. Published at 19th of July, 2023, 8:55 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 2011. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2011. Without fail, Lionel was incomparably focused. His fingers tapped at slightly different rhythms, but each of their speeds was blinding. The ores before him were quickly heated, each of them being shed of their impurities. The way he approached purification now, and the past, was vastly different. Before, his only focus was making the ore shine in its own personal strongest light. But now he saw things several steps ahead. Sometimes, he would even purposely leave impurities behind, knowing that certain changes would actually aid this or to better bind with the future pieces of the alloy. This was what it meant to have entered the life grade, comprehending the holistic view of your creation rather than dealing with individual portions. His actions moved smoothly from one step to the next. Despite the fact he was working with such a large amount of materials considering the size of the stingrays, he finished the purification process in not even 10 minutes. His speed could only be said to be mind-numbing. However, the results for those in the crowd who were laymen was underwhelming. Even from here they could see that many impurities were left behind, but they felt that this was likely the best Lionel could do given the circumstances. Only time would tell if the results would be good enough. Despite the feelings of these laymen, the Morales ancestors and the Force Crafting Guild crafters had all stood to their feet, their eyes wide as they moved forward as though they needed to get a closer glance. Lionel was keeping this relatively simple, working with just 3 sixth-dimensional ores, and of course using herb ore as a foundation. It was for partly this reason that his actions seemed to be so desperate. What could silver-grade treasures do to meaningfully change his situation at the moment? 2 of these ores were water-based, while the third was a water-wind fusion that was particularly unruly. This third ore was known as green storm ore, and what made it even odder was the fact it was a vein-type oreganone. The laymen weren't able to see the subtle actions Lionel was taking, but how could this meant that it wasn't only unruly, but one had to be delicate and finely controlled in its usage. Vein-type ores were usually built into the core of treasures, and used to write out the most integral force arts to a craft. However, the method by which Lionel was refining it, and then subsequently fusing it with 2 foundational water force ores, was just genius. Lionel made the unruly ore look like a docile child. His mind worked on a plane of its own. The laymen weren't able to see the subtle actions Lionel was taking, but how could the ancestors not? They felt as though they were seeing a prodigy rising up before their eyes. Even until now they couldn't quite comprehend how Lionel's armors were all of the life grade, but it seemed to suddenly click into place right this moment. The green storm ore was spun into a thin filament, so thin that it floated through the sky like a thread of silk, weightless and flexible. One after another, Lionel began to form the spinal bones of the armor, threading the green storm ore into the water force ores it should have clashed with. A beautiful pile of refined metals began to appear. They shimmered with blue, like sapphires sparkling beneath the ocean's surface. Within them, fine patterns of emerald glowed, giving it a mysterious appearance. At the same time, Lionel was refining one blade after another. This blade was formed by 2 wind force ores and yet another water wind, or that was once again green storm oregon. Each blade was as thin as a cicada. They fluttered through the wind like a leaf, looking much more like the thin fins of a beautiful fish rather than the blades they were. With just a single jolt, they went from fragile and flexible to incredibly tough and sharp. The craftsmanship could only be described as gorgeous. The hours ticked by, and then over a day, but it seemed to finally click. Lionel didn't need months. By the end of the third day, he would be finished. The bags around Lionel's eyes were so dark that they had become a dense black. However, his fingers continued to strike with the same speed, large numbers of armors floating in the air with a renewed sort of vigor. Lionel's wrist trembled as a force crafting pen appeared. Suddenly that force crafting pill multiplies, 2,000 appearing, one for each of his hands. He took a breath and exhaled before his hands suddenly began to move with lightning speed. The skies were filled with golden arcs and complex force arts were formed one after another like the gears of a pocket watch. The gazes of those shocked by Lionel's abilities turned to confusion. They had simply never seen such force arts before. It was completely foreign to them. They were even having trouble comprehending what they could do. Was this Lionel's trump card? Suddenly, Lionel's body froze and he felt backward, only to be caught in a soft embrace. However, by that point he was already lightly snoring. Aina looked down with a hint of worry, before looking up to the large pile of armors. Others would have a city filled with subordinates by now. The size of a gold-grade city was already enough to accommodate a population of millions. But Lionel's city was filled with these large armors instead. To forge 1,000,000 armors, even with 1,000 hands, was akin to each pair of hands completing an army every 4 to 5 minutes. Keeping up such a pace for over 72 hours. She could imagine the kind of burden he had taken on. However, while she was worried about Lionel's well-being, the human domain was in an uproar. After Lionel had finished those final strokes, the auras of the armors had solidified and took true form. Each one of those armors, without fail, was in the life grade. You're tuning in to the Lee May's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.